Some women fall apart when a marriage ends. They cry in the bathtub. They call their daughters at midnight. They sit in the parking lot of the grocery store for 20 minutes before they can make themselves go inside. And when they finally do, they spend $45 on wine and pre-made soup and cry again on the way home. I am not criticizing those women. I have been one of them. But here is what nobody tells you about the moment your husband of 34 years walks out the door with a suitcase in the dawn and a signed contract that sold your land, your grandmother planted land, your children played on land. You had worked every summer alongside him for 3 decades without asking you once. After the crying comes something else, something older, something that does not negotiate. My name is Ruth Haskell. I am 62 years old. I am a landscape architect who spent the better part of my career telling other people how to make something living out of difficult ground. And the day my husband left me with nothing but a derelict stone house in the Oklahoma panhandle and a letter from his attorney, I picked up a shovel. This is the story of what I dug up. The letter from Douglas's attorney arrived on a Tuesday in late September. I had already suspected something was wrong. Douglas had been quiet for months in the way that a man who has made a decision is quiet, not unhappy, not angry, but contained, sealed, the way a jar is sealed when someone wants to be sure nothing gets out. I had asked him twice in July what was bothering him. He said work. He said the drought. He said he wasn't sleeping well. These were true things. They were also not the true thing, and I understood the difference even if I chose, as you do, after 34 years to let it pass. The letter did not let anything pass. It was 3 pages single-spaced in the language that attorneys use when they want the words to be clear, but not human. Douglas Allen Haskell had the letter explained, executed a sale of the family farmland in Greer County, Kansas, 280 acres, 4 outbuildings, mineral rights included, to a commercial agricultural company based in Wichita. The sale had been finalized 6 weeks prior. The proceeds had been divided according to a financial arrangement Douglas had established 18 months earlier, when he had quietly moved certain assets into an account structure I was not named on. The letter also noted that Douglas would be initiating divorce proceedings within 30 days. He had not called. He had not come home. I stood at the kitchen counter with the letter in both hands and read it twice. Then I folded it along its original creases. Douglas's attorney had used good stationery, heavy stock, the kind that holds a crease cleanly, and I set it on the counter beside my coffee cup. I went to the window. The backyard of our house in Wichita was still and yellowing in the September heat. The sprinkler system had clicked off at 6:30 that morning, same as every morning. The hydrangeas I had planted along the back fence were going dormant early. It had been a hard summer. I thought he planned this for 18 months. I thought I made breakfast for him every morning for 18 months while he was planning this. I thought the hydrangeas need to be cut back before the first frost. This is how grief works when you are 62. It is not a wave. It is more like a seam opening, slow, precise running, exactly along the line where you thought you were held together. You feel it happening. You cannot stop it. And somewhere inside the opening, if you are paying attention, you find the thing that was there before the marriage, before the house, before 34 years of accommodation and compromise and love. That was real, I believe. I still believe it was real, but that had over the decades been slowly covering something older underneath. I found it now. I set down the letter. I picked up my coffee, and I began making a list. The stone house had belonged to my mother's sister Vera. Aunt Vera was not the family's favorite subject. She had married once briefly in her 20s, and when that ended, she had taken the small property her own mother left her in Cimarron County, Oklahoma, 22 acres on the edge of the high plains, dry as old bone, not much good for farming by then, and she had simply gone there to live. Not as a vacation, not as a retreat. She went there and she stayed and she lived on that land alone for 31 years until she died at 83 of a heart that gave out quietly one October morning while she was mending a fence. The family talked about Vera the way families talk about someone they cannot categorize. She wasn't unhappy exactly. She wasn't a hermit exactly. She grew a kitchen garden. She read books ordered from a library 2 towns over. She kept meticulous journals, 17 of them, lined composition, notebooks that covered her years on the property in close, careful handwriting. She repaired things. She learned what needed learning. When something broke, she figured out how to fix it because there was no one else, and she found, I learned this later, from the journals that she preferred it that way. She left the property to me, not to my mother who was her sister, not to any of my cousins who had maintained at least a polite Christmas card relationship with her. To me, because I had visited her 3 times as a child and once as a young woman, and on that last visit when I was 24 and had just gotten engaged to Douglas, she had looked at me across her kitchen table and said, "You have good hands, Ruth. Don't let anyone talk you into keeping them still." I had not thought about that sentence in 30 years. I thought about it now. I drove to Cimarron County on a Friday in early October. My daughter Claire called twice while I was packing. She wanted me to come stay with her in Denver. She said the house in Wichita needed to be dealt with, that I shouldn't just leave it, that there were legal questions, financial questions, that I needed a lawyer, that I needed a plan. All of this was true and reasonable, and I loved her for saying it, and I kept packing. My son Daniel called once and said very little, which is Daniel's way of saying he is scared and doesn't know how to help. I told him I was fine. He said okay, and I could hear that he didn't believe me, and I loved him for that too. I packed what fit in the truck: work clothes, my good boots, a box of reference books, mostly soils and native grasses, the ones I'd used professionally for decades, a hand level, a folding rule, 3 months of shelf-stable food because I had learned from 34 years of running a household to always over-prepare, a medical kit, my mother's cast-iron skillet because it is the only thing I have of hers that is still useful. I did not pack the wedding photographs. I drove southwest out of Wichita on a Thursday morning. I had lost a day somewhere in the packing, in the kind of flat white October light that makes Kansas look like the edge of the world. The landscape changed as I moved west and then south into the panhandle country, less green, more pale, more sky. The fields gave way to short grass prairie. The trees thinned to nothing. By the time I crossed into Cimarron County, the road was a straight line drawn in chalk across ochre earth, and the sky was enormous and cloudless and went on forever in every direction. I had forgotten how big it was out here. I had forgotten how quiet. Vera's property was at the end of a county road that the county had mostly stopped maintaining sometime in the early 2000s. The last 2 miles were rutted gravel that jarred my back teeth loose and left a rooster tail of dust visible for half a mile. I came over a low rise and saw it, the stone house, the barn, the windmill, standing still in no wind, the whole thing sitting small and matter-of-fact in 22 acres of dry grass going gold in the October afternoon. I sat in the truck for a moment. I thought Vera lived here for 31 years. I thought she was fine. Then I got out of the truck and started assessing damage. The house was stone proper, limestone block one, and bitted in the 1890s by someone who knew what they were doing. Stone lasts. The walls were sound, the foundation solid, the roof a different matter. Someone had patched it with corrugated tin sometime in the 1980s, and the tin had done its job and then some, but one section over the back room had lifted at the edge, and rainwater had gotten in and rotted a section of the underlying boards. I could see the damage from outside by the way the tin sat wrong. The windows were original wood single-pane warped with age, but still serviceable if you accepted that they would not keep much cold out. The front door hung slightly off, true, and required lifting slightly before it would lock. The interior was 3 rooms, a main room with a stone hearth large enough to heat the space, a back room with a rusted iron bedstead, and what had been a pantry now empty. The well was a hand pump job 40 yards from the house toward the barn. I primed it with a bucket of water I'd carried in the truck and worked the handle for 3 minutes before it caught and ran. The water came out brown, then rust-colored, then clear. I tasted it. It was good cold and slightly mineral, the taste of deep earth. The barn had stood longer than the house and in better shape. Limestone block also with a timber frame interior, still mostly sound. 3 stalls, a hayloft, empty except for old straw, and along the north wall, a workbench with tools hanging above it on pegs. Vera's tools: hand saws, a draw knife, chisels, a good hammer with a hickory, handle levels and squares and measuring tapes. All of them oiled, all of them clean. Vera had taken care of things. In the far corner of the barn, under a section of board flooring, I almost missed, I found the wooden handle of a trap door. I lifted it, and below, cut into the earth, lined with stone, accessed by a wooden ladder, was the root cellar. It was cool and dark, and smelled of earth and thyme, and something faintly sweet I couldn't immediately identify. I climbed down, my eyes adjusted. The shelves were still full. Vera's preserved goods, jars of tomatoes, beans, corn pickled, vegetables in half a dozen varieties. Fruit preserves, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling in bundles. Most of it was years old. Some of it I knew would still be good canning, done right, keeps longer than people believe. I would need to test it carefully. But the sheer fact of it, the order of it, each jar labeled in Vera's small, careful hand, the dates, the contents, the rows upon rows of evidence that she had been preparing season after season for exactly this kind of cold stopped me on the ladder. I stood there in the dark of her root cellar and understood something I hadn't been able to put words to since I left Wichita. Vera hadn't been hiding out here. She had been building something. The first week was physical in a way I had not been physical in years, and I was grateful for it. I am not a small woman, and I have never been fragile. I spent 3 decades in landscape architecture doing work that is part drafting, table, and part dirty knees. And even in the years when I was running projects rather than digging them myself, I had kept myself in reasonable condition because I am built that way, the kind of body that wants to be used that gets stiff and restless when it isn't. The work now was different from professional work. It was unmediated. There was no client approval process, no permitting, no site supervisor. There was me and the property and what needed doing. I tackled the roof first. The corrugated tin was manageable for one person if you were methodical about it. I used Vera's ladder, a heavy wooden extension ladder in the barn, still sound, and took the bad section off in pieces over 2 days, replacing the rotted sheathing boards with lumber. I drove 20 miles to get at a farm supply store in Boise City. I reflashed the edges with aluminum tape I'd brought in my supplies and reset the tin with roofing screws. It wasn't beautiful, it was watertight. The windows came next. I stripped the warped glazing compound and reglazed each pane with fresh putty. I planed the front door until it hung true. I swept 30 years of dust and mouse evidence out of the main room, scrubbed the stone floor with water from the well, and spent one long evening cleaning the hearth, a deposit of old ash and chimney debris that took 3 hours and left me blacker than I'd been since I was a child. In the evenings when the light failed and I was too tired to work, I read Vera's journals. Waha! She had started writing them the first winter on the property. The first entry was dated November 3rd and said in its entirety, "Cold. Chimney smokes if the wind is from the north. Need to figure this out." By December, she had figured it out. There is a damper trick, she wrote, a matter of warming the flue slowly before you open it fully, and the entries had lengthened, grown more reflective, moved from the purely practical to something harder to name. She wrote about the land the way a doctor writes about a patient with clinical attention that was also underneath a form of love. She wrote about the grasses, the buffalo grass and blue grandma, and the sand drop seed that came back every year, whether she asked it to or not. She wrote about the weather with respect that bordered on reverence, the way a front moved in from the north, the particular quality of light before a dry storm, the sound the wind made when it shifted. She wrote about silence, not the absence of sound. There is always sound out here, the grass and the insects and the distant complaint of a windmill, but a different kind of quiet internal, the kind that comes when you are doing necessary work in a place that is asking nothing of you but your presence. She wrote in an entry from her 7th year on the property, "I think I understand now why solitude frightened me when I was young. I thought it meant I was insufficient. I know better now. Solitude means you are finally in the room with yourself. Some people never make it there." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I got up and checked the roof again because the wind had shifted and I wanted to be sure. Bum. By the end of the 3rd week, I had the house tight and habitable. The hearth drew cleanly. The pump ran reliably after the first few strokes. I had tested 17 of Vera's jars, 7 I discarded, 10 were sound and supplemented my stores from the supply run. I had set 3 mouse traps and caught 4 mice, which told me about the dimensions of the problem, and I had located and sealed the entry point along the north wall where the stone had separated from the original mortar. I had walked every inch of the 22 acres, making notes in the same kind of composition notebook Vera had used because the farm supply store in Boise City carried them. I had not cried since the first night when I sat in the truck outside the dark house and cried hard for 20 minutes precisely as if I had allotted myself the time. Then I stopped. Not because it was over, but because the work was waiting. The land was dry and scoured and not beautiful in any way I had been trained to produce beauty. It was something else, older and less decorative and more honest, the way a working tool is more honest than an ornament. The short grass moved in the wind in long waves. The light in the morning came flat and enormous from the east, and the shadows of the windmill's vanes swept slow arcs across the ground. In the evening, the sky went colors. I have no professional terminology for not ochre, not rose, not gold, but some compound of all three that changed every minute until dark. I was not happy, but I was not somewhere else. I was here, exactly and completely here, in a way I had not been anywhere in a long time. That felt like the beginning of something. I just didn't know yet what was coming. End of part one. Part one continued. The county road that ran past the front gate saw perhaps 4 vehicles a day. I learned to distinguish them by sound before I could see them, the mail truck that came Tuesdays and Thursdays laboring over the ruts, the occasional pickup belonging to someone going further west. Once a week, more or less, a blue farm truck that slowed slightly when it passed but never stopped. I did not think much about the blue truck. There are people in rural counties who take an interest in what their neighbors are doing, and taking an interest out here is not nosiness. It is the practical result of understanding that if something goes wrong for someone on a remote piece of land, there may not be anyone close enough to notice. I filed the observations away. I had always been good at filing observations away. I had also, in 34 years of marriage, been very good at not examining them too closely. I was working on that. The attorney's name was Pamela Goss. Claire had found her a woman who specialized in matrimonial property law and who had, according to Claire, handled cases exactly like mine before. I spoke to her for the first time from the cab of my truck at the top of the county road, the only spot within a half-mile where my phone found reliable signal. The signal was still thin, 1 bar, sometimes 2, and I had to press the phone hard against my ear to hear. Pamela Goss had a flat, careful voice and the gift of not pretending things were simpler than they were. She told me what I already suspected: Douglas had been strategic and patient, and the 18 months of financial restructuring meant that recovering my full share of what the land sale had produced would require litigation, which would require time, which would require money I did not currently have in liquid form. "What do you have?" she asked. I told her the stone house and 22 acres in Cimarron County, outright mine, through inheritance, not part of the marital estate. My professional license is still current, my truck, my tools, roughly enough savings to last 8 months if I was careful. There was a pause. "Are you planning to sell the Oklahoma property?" "No," I said. Another pause, this one slightly warmer. "Good, then let's talk about what we can do." What we could do, Pamela explained over 3 calls across the following 2 weeks, was file a challenge to the asset restructuring on the grounds that I had not given informed consent to the removal of jointly held assets. It was not a guaranteed win. It would take longer than I wanted. But Douglas, she said, with the precision of a woman who had seen this particular kind of man before, had been careful but not careful enough. There were documents he had signed that implied joint ownership at points subsequent to the restructuring, which created a legal inconsistency that could be argued. I thanked her. I drove back down the county road. I went back to work. This is something that I think people underestimate about physical labor. When you are going through something difficult, it does not distract you. It does not make you forget. What it does is give the grief and the anger and the specific grinding humiliation of having been deceived by someone you trusted with your entire life. It gives all of that somewhere to go. The work is a vessel. You pour it in, and then you pick up the next thing and do the next thing, and when the day is done, you have accomplished something that is simply and inarguably true. The wall is repaired, the window seals, the roof does not leak. Nothing Douglas ever does or does not do changes that. I found my aunt's seed stock in a tin box on a shelf in the root cellar in the 2nd week of October. The box was labeled in Vera's handwriting, "Seeds tested 2019. She had packaged them herself. Small paper envelopes, each one labeled with the plant name and the year she'd saved them, folded and sealed with a strip of tape. There were 43 envelopes, mostly vegetables, tomatoes, several varieties, beans, 3 types, squash, onions, peppers, but also some things that surprised me. 2 envelopes of native grass seed, buffalo grass, and side oats as grama, and 1 envelope labeled simply sunflowers. Big, with a small drawing of a flower that made me stop and look at it for a long time. Vera had drawn a sunflower on the envelope. A simple line drawing, just a circle, and the petals and 1 leaf the way a child draws it. She had been 71 years old when she packed this seed. She had drawn a little sunflower because she wanted to, and because there was no one to see it, and because she was the kind of person who still found the shape of a sunflower worth commemorating. I put the box back carefully and climbed up out of the root cellar and stood in the barn for a while with the October light coming in through the gaps in the south wall. Vera had been drawing sunflowers, and I had been making breakfast for a man who was selling my land. I sat down on an overturned bucket and I laughed, not the crying kind of laughing, but genuine laughing, sharp and surprised, the kind that comes when you suddenly see a thing clearly for the first time. It was so simple. It was so perfectly simple. She had known what she was doing. She had come out here with nothing and made exactly the life she wanted quietly without permission from anyone for 31 years. And she had left it to me not as a consolation prize, but as a signal. Same signal she'd sent when I was 24 years old, sitting at her kitchen table: you have good hands. Use them. I had been given a message. I was 38 years late in receiving it. I could still act on it. Yeah. I began digging the kitchen garden in the third week of October. The soil in the garden plot Vera had used, I could find the faint outline of the old beds, in the way the grass grew slightly different there. Richer was caliche, heavy in the top 6 inches, then broke into better earth below. Caliche is calcium carbonate, a hardpan layer common in the southwestern plains, and it is not impossible to work through just stubborn. I broke it with a mattock. I worked in rows 6 feet at a time, an hour in the morning before the sun climbed high, and another hour in the late afternoon. I mixed in composted material from the barn, old straw and manure that had been breaking down for years in the corner. Vera had designated for exactly that purpose, and worked it into the broken caliche until the bed had some tilth to it. It was too late to plant for fall harvest. I knew that. I was preparing the beds for spring. I was doing work that would not produce anything edible for 5 or 6 months, and that was fine. That is how gardens work. You work ahead. You prepare the ground before you need it. You trust that what you are doing now will be there when the season turns. I had spent 34 years in a marriage that was not like that, a marriage where I had been very busy, very useful, and not especially looking ahead. I dug in the morning and I read in the evenings, and the days had a structure that felt right in the way that a well-fitted joint is right, not elaborate, not ornamental, just precisely the correct thing in the correct place. I was getting used to the silence. No, that is not accurate. I was getting used to what I had thought was silence, and was discovering was full of sound: the grass, the wind in different registers depending on its speed, the insects going quieter. As October deepened, the windmill, turning slowly when there was a breeze and standing still when there wasn't, coyotes at a distance in the evenings, once a great horned owl that called from somewhere behind the barn and called again and then was quiet. I read in Vera's journals that she had named the owl. She had named it Gerald, and the name had stuck through 4 different owls across the years, as if Gerald were a title rather than a proper name passed down to whoever currently held the night watch. I had been there 3 weeks before I heard my Gerald. I sat very still on the step of the stone house and listened to him call. When he stopped, the silence that came after was the best silence I had found yet. I called Claire on the last Sunday of October. She asked how I was. I told her the truth. I was tired in a good way. The roof was fixed. The garden beds were broken. I had enough wood stacked to get through November if the winter was mild, and halfway through it if it wasn't. Mom, she said, and that's not what I asked. I know, I said. Are you okay, really? I looked out across the property. The grass was going tawny now, the October light lower and more angled, the shadows long in the late afternoon. The windmill stood still in no wind. The barn cast a long shadow east. It was very quiet and very big, and I was in it entirely just myself. I think so, I said. I think I might be better than okay. I'm not sure yet. Ask me in the spring. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing. Claire is my practical child, the one who plans, who organizes, who shows up, and I know her silences. This was the silence of someone who is reassessing. Do you need anything? She asked finally. More canning lids, I said, the wide-mouthed ones, and a good headlamp. Mine is dying. I can order those. Thank you, honey. Mom, you know if you change your mind. I know, I said, I won't. Another silence, then, okay, tell me about the owl. So I told her about Gerald. I told her about Vera's journals and the sunflower envelope. I told her about the caliche soil and how it broke under the mattock and the smell of the turned earth in the cold morning. I told her about the way the light moved across the grass in the late afternoon and the particular quality of the dark out here at night, not the dark of a city or a suburb, but a real dark, a dark with depth and texture. Stars so dense they look structural, the Milky Way visible as an actual band, the way it was meant to look. She listened without interrupting, which is the best thing Claire does. When I finished, she said, "Vera sounds like someone I wish I'd known." She was, I said. She was exactly herself. I'm working on that. We said goodnight. I went inside. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals, and I added 2 pieces of wood and watched them catch and thought about Vera for a while, the woman who had come out here with nothing and made herself completely at home in her own life. Then I thought about what was coming. The weather reports I'd been checking on my phone at the top of the county road, where the signal came in, had been showing a pattern developing for the past week. A cold front building in the north stalling rebuilding. The forecasters were still hedging the way forecasters do when they can't be sure of timing, but the language was changing. The words early and significant had appeared, and those words in late October in the Oklahoma panhandle have a specific meaning. I made a list before I went to sleep. More wood, more water in the storage containers I'd found in the barn. Check the propane for the camp stove. Locate Vera's extra blankets. I'd seen them in the back room, a cedar chest of them, and I'd been meaning to air them. I had been living here for nearly a month. I had fixed what needed fixing and learned what needed learning and prepared what I could see to prepare. I realized, thought seriously yet about deep cold. Time to think about it. End of part 1. Part 1, final section. I want to say something here about being 62 years old because I think it matters to understanding what came next. People talk about aging as if it is a series of losses. And it is. I am not going to pretend otherwise. Things that were easy become harder. Recovery takes longer. The body announces its history in ways it did not when you were 30. I wake up some mornings and the cold in my hands takes a full hour to ease out, and that did not happen 20 years ago. But there is something that nobody young understands and that nobody old seems to bother explaining by 62. If you have been paying attention, you know yourself very well. You know which discomforts are serious and which are just noise. You know how long you can push before you need to stop, and you know the difference between tired done and tired almost there. You know what you are made of because you have had 62 years to find out. What I was made of, it turned out, was this. I was made of the same material as Vera. Not glamorous material, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that holds. I had spent 34 years not using most of it. I had poured it into a marriage and a career and a house and a family, all of which I had done with genuine care, and all of which had been worth doing, and I am not saying otherwise. But the part of me that was Vera's material, the part that did not require anyone else's permission or approval or recognition to keep going, that part had been sitting unused or mostly unused for a very long time. It was awake now. I could feel it the way you feel a muscle you haven't used in years. A little stiff at first, a little uncertain, but fundamentally sound. Fundamentally strong. It had been waiting. It knew what it was for. I did not know yet what November was going to ask of me. But whatever it was, I understood standing in Vera's kitchen in the last light of October, looking out at the prairie going dark in the east, in the sky going that impossible compound of gold and rose in the west. I understood that I was ready to answer. This is not bravery, I should tell you. Bravery is what you need when you are afraid. What I had was something quieter and more useful than bravery. It was the particular confidence of a woman who has finally stopped waiting for someone to tell her she is capable. I already knew I was capable. I'd just forgotten to live like it. I banked the coals in the hearth. I checked my supply list. I checked the weather again. The cold front was still building, the forecasters now using the word substantial, which I noted, and then I went to bed. Outside, Gerald called once from behind the barn. The dark was enormous and complete and full of stars. I slept without dreaming the way you sleep when the day has been exactly right. The first sign was the smell. I had learned in 6 weeks on the Oklahoma panhandle to read weather through my nose before my eyes. The high plains have a particular smell before a cold front arrives, something metallic and clean, like the inside of a well layered over the dry grass smell that is the constant baseline of the place. It comes in from the north, usually ahead of the clouds by several hours. And if you know what you're smelling, it tells you to finish what you're doing and get inside. I smelled it on the 2nd of November, a Tuesday, while I was splitting firewood behind the barn. I stopped splitting and looked north. The sky was doing something wrong. Not the dramatic movie storm wrong. No anvil clouds, no green light, none of the theatrical signals that even people who don't spend time outdoors can read. What I saw was subtler and more serious, a uniform gray pressing down from the north, erasing the horizon, moving with the methodical purpose of something that does not hurry because it does not need to. It was still an hour away, maybe two. I looked at the wood I'd split. The stack against the north wall of the house was adequate for 2 cold nights, not for whatever that sky was carrying. I picked up the maul and kept splitting. Then I worked for 90 minutes without stopping. My arms and shoulders had been building in these weeks. The kind of strength that comes not from a gym, which is a simulation of work, but from actual work, cumulative and progressive, the way the body has always built itself when asked to. I could feel it now, the maul swinging clean, the split happening at the right angle, my back staying straight. Vera had kept a good maul. The handle was hickory like all her handles, and she had maintained it with linseed oil so the grain was still tight and the wood didn't pull moisture. I stacked as I split. I filled the rack against the north wall and started a second stack along the east side of the house where the stone would shield it from direct weather. I worked until my hands were numb and the sky had moved another degree of gray closer and the temperature had dropped. I could feel it in my face, a good 15 degrees from where it had been at noon. I went inside. I brought in 2 armloads of wood for the immediate pile by the hearth. I filled every pot and container I had with water from the pump and lined them along the wall. If the pump froze, I'd need reserve. I made sure the propane canister for the camp stove was full. I checked my food stores. I checked Vera's journals for anything she'd written about serious winter. She had written about it. Of course she had. November 1997. Front came in hard overnight wind from the north at sustained 40. Temperature dropped to 4 above. Lost 2 days to the house, couldn't leave, couldn't do anything but tend the fire and wait. The key is the fire and the water. If you have those 2 things in sufficient quantity, the rest is just patience. February 2008. Blizzard conditions for 36 hours. Drifts against the north wall came up past the window. I was comfortable the entire time. Stove held, well held, stores held. I read all of the brothers Karamazov. I checked my own stores. I had not read Dostoevsky, but I had Vera's journals and my own field notebooks in the quiet competence of a woman who has been paying attention. I built the fire up and settled in. The wind came first before the snow. It arrived around 8 in the evening as a low sound I could feel in the stone walls, as much as hear a deep, continuous pressure, not gusting but steady, the kind of wind that has been traveling a long distance and hasn't tired yet. The temperature on the outdoor thermometer I'd mounted beside the front door read 19 degrees. I watched it drop to 16 while I stood there. Then 12. The snow started around 10. Not the gentle, picturesque kind. This was horizontal, driven flat by the north wind, hitting the windows at an angle, the sound of it like a fine, continuous spray of sand. I could see nothing through the glass but white motion and my own reflection. I did not mind the snow. What I minded was the truck. I had known the truck might not start in serious cold, the battery was not new, and the engine had a mild temperament about low temperatures, but I had not thought hard enough about what that would mean in practical terms. It meant no driving to Boise City for supplies if something ran out. It meant no driving to the top of the county road for phone signal if I needed help. It meant that for the duration of the storm, whatever it brought, I was here on this property with what I had. I stood at the frosted window and I worked through this very clearly, the way I would work through a site assessment. What are the assets? What are the vulnerabilities? What are the contingencies? Assets: full woodpile for 2, possibly 3 days of heavy burn. Water reserve approximately 15 gallons stored plus the pump, which might freeze at the soil level but was deep enough that it might not. Food for a month. The hearth, which Vera had trusted through worse than this. 2 wool blankets from the cedar chest, heavy as slabs. A headlamp with fresh batteries. Claire had ordered it. It had arrived 2 weeks before. The root cellar, which maintained a stable temperature regardless of outside conditions. Vulnerabilities. The roof patch over the back room, which I had fixed but not tested under heavy snow load. The front door, which I had planned and sealed, but which had a gap at the threshold I hadn't quite gotten to. The single-pane windows, which would lose heat faster than anything else in the house. Contingencies. If the house got too cold, the root cellar was an option. Underground, it would stay at roughly 50 degrees no matter what was happening above. It was not comfortable, but it was survivable. I got the threshold gap first. I found a strip of dense felt in Vera's tool supplies. She had kept fabric scraps in a box in the barn, organized by material and thickness. which I had found charming and now found essential, and tacked it along the bottom of the door. The cold that had been seeping in stopped. Then I went out into the blizzard to check the roof. This was, I will acknowledge, not a decision everyone would have made. It was 11 at night. The temperature was somewhere below 10 degrees. The wind was pushing 40 miles an hour from the north, and the snow was horizontal, and my headlamp was doing its best and doing it inadequately. I had put on every layer I owned: 2 pairs of wool socks, insulated work pants, a heavyweight thermal shirt, a wool sweater, my canvas work coat, a wool hat, pulled-down leather gloves inside canvas mittens. I went out because the roof was the thing I couldn't fix from inside once something went wrong, and I needed to know its condition before I lost visibility entirely. The snow was already 6 inches at the base of the north wall, drifting higher. I made my way around to the east side of the house where my ladder was stored under the barn overhang. The wind was brutal, but not disordering. Cold is much more manageable than people think if you stay moving and have good layers. And I got the ladder and set it against the east wall, which was slightly sheltered, and went up. The roof was holding. The section I'd patched was clear. The corrugated tin was channeling snow off the roof rather than holding it, which was the correct thing for it to do, and the flashing at the edges was still sealed. There was some accumulation against the north parapet where the tin met the stone, but not enough to threaten the structure. I came down the ladder and put it back under the overhang and stood in the noise and cold of the storm for a moment, looking at the property. I could not see the barn. I could not see the windmill. I could not see the gate. There was the house, its stones visible for maybe 15 feet before the blowing snow dissolved everything, and the headlamp beam going nowhere useful in all that white motion, and the wind and the cold, and me. I was not afraid. This is the thing I want to say clearly, because people will assume that fear is the appropriate response to this situation, and they're not wrong. Fear would be reasonable, but I was not afraid. I was present. I was here in the storm, standing in my good boots on my land, and the storm was doing what it was going to do, and I had done what I could do, and the rest of it was just weather. I had survived 34 years of a marriage to a man who was building a secret life. I could survive a blizzard. I went inside. I built the fire up to its maximum and stripped off my wet outer layers and hung them near the hearth to dry, and wrapped myself in Vera's wool blankets and sat in the old chair that had been hers and read her journals by firelight and listened to the storm do what storms do. I see. By morning, the wind had not lessened. The thermometer, which I checked by opening the door 6 inches and closing it quickly, read 7 degrees. The snow had drifted up past the lower window ledges on the north side. The front door opened inward, which meant I could still open it. An outward swinging door drifted against and would have been a problem, but stepping out required pushing through a knee-high wall of accumulated snow on the threshold. I did not step out. There was nothing to be done outside and several things to be done inside. The fire needed tending every 2 hours. This is the central fact of living with a wood-burning hearth in serious cold. The fire is your job. You tend it before you sleep, and you set an alarm, and you tend it again in the night, and you tend it in the morning before you do anything else, because a fire that has gone to cold ash in a stone house in 7-degree weather is a serious problem that takes a long time to correct. I tended the fire. I ate oatmeal in the morning soup from one of Vera's tested jars at noon, heated on the camp stove, more substantial than it had any right to be after years in the cellar. I read. I did the stretching routine I developed in the first weeks moving through Vera's small rooms, because stillness in cold stiffens you, and stiffness in an emergency is a liability. I thought about Douglas. I had not let myself think about him directly very much since I arrived. This was not denial. I am not good at denial, but a deliberate choice to let the work be the thing, to not spend the energy I needed for the land on the retrospective autopsy of the marriage. But now, in the second day of the storm, with the wind still pressing on the walls and the fire needing tending, and nothing to do but read and think and wait, I let myself think about it. What I found when I went directly at it was not what I expected. I expected grief or anger or the humiliating loop of wondering what I'd missed and when and whether I could have done something differently. Those things were there somewhere underneath. But what came up first and kept coming up was something more like recognition. I had been unhappy, not loudly, not in any way that demanded response or explanation or intervention, but quietly, in the specific way of someone who has accommodated herself so thoroughly to a structure that she can no longer see it as a choice. I had been unhappy for a long time. I had told myself it was the nature of long marriages, the way comfort and companionship replace earlier intensities. I had told myself it was enough. In many ways, it had been enough. I was not constructed for easy drama, and my life had been full of things worth doing, and I am not going to retroactively paint those years as a loss. But I had not been living in my own life. I had been living in a shared life that had over the decades become more his than mine without either of us precisely intending it. And when it ended, when he took what he could and walked out, the thing I lost was not all bad. Some of what I lost was weight. I had not expected that. I tended the fire. I heated another jar of soup. I read Vera's account of the 2008 blizzard. She had come through it with equanimity and a finished Dostoevsky, and I felt something I can only describe as kinship reaching 31 years across the gap between her life and mine. You were here, I thought. You figured it out. So will I.
对的，
The storm broke on the third day. It did not end gradually. The wind simply stopped between 8 and 9 in the morning, the way a switch is thrown. One moment, the noise and pressure, and then quiet, and then the particular silence of a world that has been remade overnight by snow. I went to the window. The property was unrecognizable. The contours I had learned in 6 weeks were gone under a uniform white drifted into curves where there had been angles, every familiar landmark altered. The barn was still there. I could see the dark line of its roof line against a sky that had gone overnight to the particular hard blue that follows winter storms out here. The windmill stood above the white like a monument. The snow was 2 feet deep on the flat and 4 feet in the drifts. I put on every layer again and went outside. The cold was still serious, around 15 degrees, I estimated, with no wind now, but manageable, and the silence was extraordinary. I have never been in a silence like that before or since. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a different kind of listening. The world suddenly muffled and reorganized every sound that did exist. My footsteps, my breathing, a bird somewhere to the south clarified and sharpened by the surrounding white quiet. I walked to the barn. I walked to the windmill. I walked to the gate and back. My land, changed blanketed temporarily unrecognizable, but mine. I had been here for 3 days and 2 nights, in a blizzard with no vehicle, no phone signal, no external assistance of any kind, and I was standing here in the snow and the hard blue morning light without having lost anything that mattered. I had the fire, I had the water, I had the stores, I had Vera's journals, and my own good sense, and the 31 years of example that a woman had laid down in this place before me. I had done exactly what needed doing, not bravely, just steadily, just because there was no other choice, and also because this exactly was what I was built for, had always been built for, had just never been given the occasion to be. I stood in the snow in my boots in the January cold November morning, and I breathed the cold air and I felt it go all the way down. And then I heard something that was not a bird and not the windmill. A truck, the blue truck, coming slowly up the county road. I watched it come. The blue truck moved along the county road with the careful patience of someone who understood snow, not the headlong confidence of someone who owned a 4-wheel drive and trusted it too much, but the measured, deliberate pace of a driver who knows exactly how much she can ask of the ground beneath her and has calculated accordingly. It fishtailed once lightly at the low point where the road dipped and the drifting had been worst and recovered without drama. It stopped at my gate. The woman who got out was not young and not particularly tall, and she moved with a particular economy of someone who has been doing outdoor work for a very long time. No wasted motion, no hesitation, just the clean sequence of getting out, closing the door, looking. She was wearing a canvas barn coat, the color of dried grass, and heavy boots, and a wool hat with a crease in it that suggested it had been washed many times. She had gray hair cut short and a face that the plains had weathered into something honest and unhurried. She looked at me across the top of my gate. "You Vera Dunham's girl," she said. Her voice carried flat and clear in the cold. "Niece," I said. She nodded. That apparently settled something. "I'm Delia Marsh. I run the place 2.5 miles west." She gestured with one hand west in the direction the road continued. "Saw your smoke all 3 days. Figured if it kept going, you were all right, and it did, but I thought I'd come check once it was passable." I thought about what it meant that she had watched my smoke. "You were checking on me," I said. "I was watching the smoke," she said, making a small distinction. "Vera used to do the same thing in hard weather. We had an arrangement. Smoke means okay. No smoke means send someone. She ever mention that to you?" "She didn't," I said, "but she would have approved of the system." Something shifted in Delia's face, not quite a smile, but the terrain of a smile. You get through all right. Roof held, pump didn't freeze, I have plenty of stores. She nodded again. Caliche soil insulates the pipe better than people expect. She reached back into the truck cab and came out with a canvas bag that she set on the gate post. Brought you some things. Flour mostly I had extra from my fall baking. And a propane cylinder. I find after a storm you've gone through more than you thought you would. I walked to the gate and picked up the bag. It was heavier than I expected, not just flour and propane, but the weight of a considered act. The kind of thing you do when you understand what it costs to be somewhere alone in hard weather, and you want to reduce the cost a little without making it into something larger than it needs to be. Thank you, I said. Your aunt was a good neighbor, Delia said. Reliable. The reliable ones are worth knowing out here. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. The pause of two people assessing each other without hurry, the way you do when you are going to be neighbors for years, and you both know it, and neither of you sees the point in rushing the assessment. I've got coffee on, I said. Delia looked at the property. At the house. At the garden beds I'd broken in October, the mounded snow over them now. At the barn. You dug those beds yourself, she said. It was not a question. Broke the caliche with a mattock, I said. It took a while. She looked at me directly for the first time with the full weight of her attention. All right, she said. I'll have that coffee. Bah. We sat at Vera's table in Vera's kitchen and drank coffee from Vera's heavy ceramic mugs, and Delia told me things I needed to know. She told me about the aquifer depth. The hand pump would stay unfrozen to about -8, she said, and if it ever did freeze, I could thaw it with hot water over the casing slowly and patiently. She told me about the caliche hard pan and the layer of red clay beneath it, and what that meant for spring planting, raised beds she recommended, bring in good topsoil from the farm supply. The clay would need years of amendment before it was reliably productive. She told me about the county road and the county's schedule for plowing it. They did it once per storm, usually the second day in the section past the last inhabited property west, which was her place they sometimes skipped. If they skip it, she said, and you need to get out, put a red flag on your gate. I'll come get you. I have a truck, I said. I have a plow, she said. I thought about that arrangement. It was the same kind of arrangement she'd had with Vera, practical, mutual, not sentimental. The kind of arrangement people make in places where the distances are real and the infrastructure is unreliable, and you cannot afford to be prideful about needing help. All right, I said. Red flag on the gate. She told me about the property's history. The previous owners before Vera had tried to farm it dryland wheat and failed because the rainfall was too unreliable for wheat without irrigation, and they hadn't understood that when they bought it. Vera had understood it immediately, Delia said, and had shifted to a kitchen garden supplemented by native planting, which made more sense for the conditions. Smart woman. She knew soils, I said. She could read them. She taught herself, Delia said. Said she'd had no formal training. Said she just paid attention. I have formal training, I said. I'm a landscape architect. Delia looked at the garden beds through the window, at the way I'd oriented them, south-facing, which caught the maximum sun in the low-angle winter light. I can see that, she said. We talked for 2 hours. Not personal things, not yet. We were not at that stage, and both of us knew it. We talked about the land, about the grasses and the soil, and the water table, and the weather patterns, and the management of a small property in a semi-arid climate. It was the most professionally engaging conversation I had had in years. Delia had been on her property for 30 years. She'd come out after her own marriage ended. She mentioned it briefly and without drama as a fact, and she had the knowledge that comes from 3 decades of paying attention to a specific piece of earth. She knew things I didn't. I knew things she didn't. This was evident within the first 20 minutes, and neither of us had any interest in pretending otherwise. When she got up to leave, she paused at the door and looked at the journals on the shelf, all 17 of Vera's composition notebooks arranged chronologically. Have you read them, she said. Working through them, I said. She mentions me in the later ones, Delia said. Not often. She wasn't one for a lot of personal detail. A pause. She did say once that she thought you'd be the one to use the place properly. Years ago. Before she died. I stood very still. She said you had the right kind of hands. Delia adjusted her wool hat. I didn't know what she meant at the time. I think I do now. She went out. Her truck moved back down the county road the way it had come, careful and unhurried, until the distance took it. I stood at the window and watched it go. The sky was the color it gets when the cold is still serious, but the worst is over, a thin high blue, very clear with the pale disk of the sun moving west and throwing long shadows across the white field. The windmill was turning again in a light breeze, the creak of it audible in the silence. "You have good hands, Ruth." Vera's hands. Vera's land. Vera's neighbor, now mine. I had been here 6 weeks. I had fixed the roof and planed the door and broken the calache and survived a blizzard and been found by a woman who watched my smoke and drove 2.5 miles to bring me flour and propane and the particular kind of information that you cannot get from books. I had not fallen apart. I had not gone to Denver. I had not waited for someone to tell me I was capable. I went to the shelf and took down Vera's journal number. 11, the one from the mid-2000s, the one I was currently reading, and sat back down in the chair and kept going. Outside, the snow was brilliant in the cold afternoon light. Somewhere behind the barn, a great horned owl was making a sound. I was beginning to understand was not a territorial call, but a welcome, the low, patient sound of a thing that has been here longer than any of us and plans to stay. Gerald, I thought. I was beginning to feel like myself. And what a thing it was after 62 years in one marriage to be getting acquainted. The days after the blizzard had a quality I have been trying to put words to ever since. The best I can do is this, they felt earned. I do not mean that in a sentimental way, not the greeting card sense of having survived something and therefore deserving a reward. I mean it more literally the way a carpenter means it when she looks at a piece of work and knows the dovetail is right, because she cut it correctly, because she measured and considered and executed with the right tool at the right angle, and the joint holds because it was made to hold. The days after the blizzard held. They were right in the way that right things are right simply, completely, without requiring any argument. I repaired the one place on the south wall where the mortar had cracked in the freeze-thaw. I cleared the drifts from the garden beds with a flat-bladed shovel, working slowly. Not because I lacked energy, but because working slowly was correct. You don't rush clearing snow from beds. You want to survive winter. You move it carefully. You don't compress the soil beneath you. Think about what comes next. I opened Vera's seed box again and sat with it in the afternoon light, making a plan. Delia came back on Saturday with her truck and a bag of seed catalogs. "You'll want to order for spring," she said, setting them on the table with the matter-of-fact manner of someone who does not apologize for being useful. We spent the afternoon at the table going through them. She knew which varieties did well in the panhandle and which were bred for the more favorable climates of seed catalog photography. She knew the frost dates last in spring, first in fall, and the microclimates of the property, the way the barn created a wind shadow that made the beds on its south side reliably warmer, the way the calache hardpan held moisture differently from standard clay in the early spring. I drew diagrams in my composition notebook while she talked the professional drafting habit that never goes away, and she watched the diagrams take shape with the interest of someone who thinks spatially and appreciates seeing thought made visible. "You're going to do this right," she said. It was an observation, not flattery. "I'm going to try to do it the way Vera did it," I said, paying attention, figuring out what the land needs. Delia was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee. "Vera would like that," she said finally. She was particular about this ground, said it had more in it than people gave it credit for, that you just had to ask it the right questions. I thought about the soil, the calache and the clay, and the deep red earth beneath the aquifer water, rising clean through 40 feet of stone, the native grasses coming back every year, unrequested, persistent, and drought-adapted, and perfectly suited to this place. The land that everyone who tried to farm it conventionally had given up on, and that Vera had simply accepted on its own terms and found on its own terms sufficient. She was right, I said. It has more in it. Delia left before dark, as she always did. She had animals to tend, a property that required the same daily attention mine did. We made no particular plans and issued no particular invitations. We did not need to. The arrangement had the naturalness of things that fit. I watched her truck go and turned back to my property. The snow was melting at the edges where the sun hit it slowly in the single-digit cold, but definitively because that is what the sun does. The garden beds I'd broken in October were still under white, but I could see in the geometry of the mounded snow the shape of what I'd made the rows, the orientation, the particular attention I had brought to this ground. I thought about the spring. I thought about Vera's sunflower seeds, the envelope with the little drawing. I thought about where I would plant them along the south fence. I decided where the wall would catch heat, and they'd have room to grow to their full height, visible from the road, visible from the house. Not for anyone else, just because sunflowers are worth growing. Just because Vera had thought so and so did I. The attorney Pamela Goss had called 2 days before the storm with an update. The legal inconsistency she'd identified in Douglas's restructuring was holding up under scrutiny. The case would move slowly, these things always did, but she was cautiously optimistic that a significant portion of what I was owed would be recoverable. I had thanked her and hung up and felt something. Not relief exactly, and not satisfaction. More like the closing of a parenthesis. One thing was happening in its way, and would continue to happen in its way, and that was right, and I would monitor it and respond when response was required. And in the meantime, I was here doing this other thing, which was the real thing. Building. That is the word I kept coming back to. Not surviving, though I had survived. Not recovering, though recovery was happening quietly and in its own time, the way healing always happens underground, out of sight until one day you reach for something and find that it doesn't hurt anymore. Building. Something that was mine. Something made from difficult ground and patient attention, and the example of a woman who had done it before me and left her journals on the shelf and her seeds in the tin, and her neighbor 2.5 miles down the road with a plow and a habit of watching for smoke. I was 62 years old, and I was at the beginning of something. Not a new life. I do not believe in the mythology of the new life, the clean break, the fresh start that erases what came before. The old life was in me, all of it, and I did not want to excise it. But I was at the beginning of a life that was fully mine in a way the previous 34 years had not been mine, in the choosing mine, in the doing mine, in the daily decisions about what mattered and what didn't. I went inside. I built up the fire. I sat in Vera's chair. I opened journal number 12, November 2001, the year she had planted her first stand of native grasses, and watched the prairie start to come back. And I read until the light was gone and the fire was the only light, orange and steady, doing its ancient job. Outside, the panhandle dark came down enormous and complete. The stars were so thick they looked structural. Gerald called once from behind the barn. I was home. December came in without drama. After the blizzard of early November, after 3 days sealed in a stone house with a fire and a dead truck, and the particular silence of a world under 2 feet of snow, I had expected the next challenge to arrive with similar intensity. The panhandle was teaching me its nature, and its nature was not subtle. But December was different. Cold, yes, the mornings running between 5 and 20 degrees, the afternoons rarely climbing past 35, but clear. Clear in the way that high-altitude, low-humidity air is clear, a sharpness to everything. Every edge defined the sky, a flat, hard blue that went on without interruption from horizon to horizon. I had the wood, I had the stores, I had the hand pump, which I now understood well enough to maintain, and Vera's journals for guidance in Delia 2.5 miles down the road. What I did not have going into December was a clear sense of what came next with Douglas. Pamela Goss called on the first Monday of the month. I had started making the drive to the top of the county road every Monday morning to catch her call. I had described the signal arrangement to her, and she had adapted to it with the pragmatism of a woman who has learned to work around many obstacles. I sat in the truck cab with the heater running and took notes in my composition notebook with my leather gloves still on because my hands stiffened in the cold even with the heater. The news was measured. Progress, but slow. The financial inconsistency in Douglas's restructuring was holding up under scrutiny. There were 3 documents that showed joint asset treatment at points after the account separation, which Pamela characterized as either careless or arrogant, and I thought both knowing Douglas. He had been careful in the large strokes and sloppy in the details the way men often are when they believe no one is looking closely enough to notice. The other side wants to settle, Pamela said. For how much? She told me the figure they'd offered. I did the math against what I knew the land sale had produced and said nothing for a moment. That's 50 cents on the dollar, I said. A little less, she said. I'd push back. I think they'll move. Push back, I said. Don't settle for less than 70%. There was a brief pause. The pause of an attorney who was slightly surprised and slightly pleased by her client's clarity. Understood, she said. I drove back down the county road. The frozen ruts made the truck shudder, which made my jaw tighten. I made a note in the composition book, call county road office, ask about grading schedule spring. I was not waiting for the settlement to live my life. That is the thing I want to be clear about. Whatever Pamela recovered I would use well, but I was not suspended in the waiting. I was here doing this, and the legal matter was a current running underneath the day's work rather than the work itself. The day's work in December was this: I was going to build a proper dugout. Okay. Vera's root cellar was under the barn floor, dug straight down, accessed by a vertical ladder adequate for storage, but not for extended habitation. In the November blizzard, I had taken shelter in the stone house, which had been the right choice then, but I had been thinking since about the physics of the situation. The stone house was above ground and lost heat through its single-pane windows and the gap under the door in the thin mortar of a century ago. A below-grade structure, a proper earth shelter dug into a hillside with a framed entry and adequate ventilation would hold heat by the simple thermodynamics of being surrounded by earth that maintained 50 degrees regardless of surface conditions. Vera had not built one. She had not needed to. She had the stone house and the cellar and 31 years of accumulated knowledge of exactly what each bad storm would require. I did not have 31 years yet. I had 6 weeks and a blizzard, and the specific knowledge that there was a situation in which a deeper kind of shelter would be the correct answer. There was a south-facing hillside behind the barn, not a dramatic hill. This was the panhandle, which does not do dramatic hills, but enough of a rise, maybe 12 feet above the barn floor level, and south-facing, which meant it caught sun and drained cold air away from it rather than pooling it. An ideal site. I spent 3 days on the plan before I touched a shovel. This is the landscape architect in me. You do not begin until you have read the site completely. I walked the slope at different times of day and noted the sun angles and the drainage patterns and the soil profile, which I could read from a 2-foot probe hole I dug with a post hole digger, revealing 6 inches of dry topsoil, over 12 inches of that caliche hardpan over good clay, and gravel beneath the gravel being excellent for drainage. I noted the wind patterns. The barn would provide a windbreak to the north, leaving the entry sheltered. I found the precise orientation that would give me maximum solar exposure on the entry, faced while keeping the main chamber below the frost line. On the 4th day, I began digging. Let me tell you about digging when you are 62 years old and not accustomed to it. Your back knows about it first. Not in a warning way, not the sharp signal that means stop immediately, but the deep bilateral ache of muscles working in a new plane, muscles that are fit from splitting and lifting and planing, but not specifically from the forward lean and lift of a long-handled spade working a hillside. On the 1st day, I dug for 2 hours and stopped. On the 2nd day, I dug for 3. By the end of the 1st week, I was doing 5 hours with a break at midday, and the backache was still there but had converted from complaint to information. This is the work you're doing. It is said this is the cost. Here are the muscles involved. I respected it. I stretched. I did not push past the clear signal. I was not in a hurry. The caliche hardpan was the worst of it. 6 inches of topsoil came out easily dry, sandy, crumbling, but when the spade hit the caliche layer, it rang like hitting rock. I switched to the mattock for that layer, the same tool I'd used on the garden beds, and broke it section by section, loosened with the mattock scoop with the spade dump in the wheelbarrow, pushed the wheelbarrow up the plank I'd laid on the slope, and dump it 20 feet east, where I was building a berm that would eventually serve as additional wind protection on the east side of the entry. Below the caliche came clay. Clay is hard in a different way, not brittle, but dense, waterlogged in the deeper sections, smelling of iron and old water and geological time. This was the layer where the work slowed and the cold began to matter less, because the clay held its temperature, and the sun, even in December, heated the south-facing cut face enough to keep the digging manageable. I built the chamber to be 8 feet deep into the hillside, 7 feet wide, 6 feet of ceiling at the center. Not spacious, but sufficient. Sufficient for a person and a fire. I planned a small rocket-style stove using fire brick I ordered from Boise City, which would burn hot and efficiently on small-diameter wood. Sufficient for a cot and supplies and several days of self-contained existence if the stone house became untenable. I lined the walls with the limestone block I excavated from the path, cut the caliche layer, had produced slabs suitable for stacking, and mortared them with a bag mortar I mixed in a 5-gallon bucket. I was not a mason, but Vera had been many things she had not trained for, and her mortar work in the root cellar, which I had studied carefully before beginning my own, was patient and competent rather than artistic. I aimed for patient and competent. I framed the entry with the barn timber. I had good old growth, pine dense and dry, the kind that does not warp. The door was a matter I thought about for a week before I built it. Not a standard door, which would require hinges I didn't have in the right size, but a removable panel system, 2 layers of 1-inch pine planking, with a layer of rigid foam insulation between them, sized to fit the opening precisely and held in place by timber cleats. You lifted it into position from inside, and it sealed against a felt gasket I cut from Vera's fabric scraps. Not permanent, removable from inside with minimal effort. The ventilation was 2 4-inch pipes, one near the floor for cold air intake, one near the ceiling for warm air exhaust, a passive exchange system that would prevent carbon monoxide buildup from the stove while maintaining a positive airflow that kept humidity manageable. Delia came to look at it on the day I finished the main chamber. She stood at the entry, the framed opening in the cut hillside, the berm I'd built to the east, the small pitched wooden roof over the entry that shed rain and snow without requiring me to dig it out after each storm, and looked without saying anything for almost a minute. "Your aunt never did this," she said. "She didn't need to," I said. "She knew what she was doing by then. You know what you're doing now." "I know what I studied for," I said. "The rest is figuring out how to make the study work in the ground you actually have." Delia nodded slowly. She came down the entry steps I'd cut them into, the clay, lined them with limestone slabs, and stood in the chamber and looked at the walls and the framing and the ventilation pipes and the corner where I'd set the fire brick for the stove. "Warm in here," she said. The temperature outside was 22 degrees. Inside the chamber, unheated, it was 48. "Earth does that," I said. 50 degrees is what the soil wants to be here at this depth. You put a person and a small stove in here, and it stays livable without much effort." She studied the mortar work. She ran her hand along the limestone stacking, without commenting, which I took as approval, since Delia's forms of approval were generally the absence of correction rather than active praise. "I have a cot frame in my barn I'm not using," she said. "Old canvas army cot, still serviceable." "I'd be grateful," I said. "I'll bring it Saturday." She brought it Saturday along with a box of fire brick end pieces she'd been keeping and hadn't known what to do with, which completed my stove corner without the need for another supply run. We set the cot up together, sliding the canvas onto the frame, tightening the lacing. It took 15 minutes, and we worked without unnecessary conversation, which was our way. When it was done, we sat on the cot, and I lit the first fire in the small stove the chimney drew on the first attempt, which is the result of careful planning and also some luck, and the temperature in the chamber climbed from 48 to 62 degrees in 20 minutes. "Your aunt would have liked this," Delia said. "She would have thought of it first," I said. "Probably," Delia allowed. "But she didn't, you did." We sat in the warmth of the underground room while December pressed on the ground above and said very little in the way of people who have learned that the quiet between them is comfortable and does not need filling. Christmas came and went without event. Claire and Daniel wanted me to come to Denver. I said no thank you. I called them both on Christmas morning from the top of the county road with the heater running and the pale winter sun just up over the flat horizon. And I told them truthfully that I was fine. More than fine, specifically fine, not generically fine the way you are when something in your life is working correctly. Claire said, "You sound different." "I am different," I said. "I'll try to explain it in person. Come in the spring." She said she would. I believed her. Daniel said, "Mom, I need you to know I'm sorry I didn't," and stopped. "You don't need to be sorry for anything," I said. "You're my son. You didn't do this." "I know, but I should have seen." "Daniel," I said it gently but clearly, "stop. Come in the spring. Bring your sister. I have something to show you." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Is it a hole in the ground?" I laughed out loud in the cab of the truck, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere undefended. "It's a very well-engineered hole in the ground," I said. "That's my mom," he said. January was the cold month. The panhandle does not always get significant snow. The moisture comes from the south and west, and sometimes the winter storms pull too far east before they drop their load, but it gets cold. January delivered 2 weeks of persistent, single-digit mornings, the kind of cold where moisture from your breath freezes in the first few inches, and the sound of boots on frozen ground is different from any other sound, a specific high-pitched compression that means the earth is entirely rigid. I used the dugout for the first time not as an emergency, but as a deliberate choice. The stone house required serious fire management in that kind of cold every 2 hours, adding wood, losing heat every time I opened the door to go to the woodpile. The dugout required almost nothing. The small stove ran on arm-sized split wood burning hot and efficient, and the earth walls and the insulated door held the produced heat so well that once I'd brought the interior temperature to 65, keeping it there, took one addition of wood every 4 hours. I slept in the dugout 3 nights during the worst of the cold on the army cot, with Vera's wool blankets and my own sleeping bag, and I slept better than I had since leaving Wichita. The silence underground was different from the silence above. Above the wind was always a presence. Even on the still days, the grass talked to itself. The windmill moved in some current that you couldn't feel at ground level. The distance between you and the next human being made itself known in 100 small sounds in the absence of sounds. Below in the chamber, there was a different quality, a density to the quiet, a settled mineral weight. The earth held still. Whatever was happening on the surface, wind or cold, or the methodical work of a December that was indifferent to everything in it, was at one remove. You were below it. You were in the part of the world that does not change with weather. I understood lying in that cot in the January dark, with the small stove ticking and the chamber at 65 degrees, and the ground pressing its patient temperature through the limestone walls on every side, why Vera had been fine out here. Why she had been more than fine. She had found the layer that doesn't change, and she had built her life around it. Déjà. Pamela called in late January with the settlement news. They had moved, not to 70% to 68, which was close enough, and came with a provision that the settlement would be processed within 30 days, which meant that in February I would have access to a sum of money that would make the next several years substantially more workable. I told Pamela to accept it. She confirmed the terms. We went through the paperwork she needed from me. I would drive to Boise City and fax from the library, which still had a fax machine in the way that rural libraries still have things cities have abandoned. We scheduled a call for the following week. You did well, Pamela said before she hung up. I had a good attorney, I said. You knew what you wanted, she said. That makes my job easier. A lot of clients in your situation, they're not sure. They want to be told. You came in knowing. I thought about that on the drive back down the county road, knowing what I wanted. When had I learned that? Was it Vera's journals, the mattock-breaking cliché, the 3 nights in a blizzard without anything to call the 48 degrees of a hillside in December? All of it, I thought. All of it together. The same way soil builds, not in a day, not in a season, but layer by layer, each element breaking down and combining with what's below it until you have something that can hold a seed. I had been building soil these months on this land. I was ready, I thought, to begin planting. I want to tell you about February because February is when I made the first mistake. Not a serious mistake, not the kind with permanent consequences, but a real one, and I had made it before I recognized it, which is usually how mistakes work. Pamela's settlement cleared on the 8th of February. The figure arrived in my account on a Tuesday, and I sat with it for a day before I did anything. Then I made a list. It is always a list for me. It is how I organize the world of what I needed. The stone house, new windows. Not the antique single pane which I'd maintained, but which were losing too much heat. Double pane would transform the heating situation and reduce the wood consumption by a third. I priced them from the farm supply and a mill workshop in Guimon. Reasonable. The garden raised beds, topsoil and compost brought in to correct the caliche situation rather than fight it indefinitely. Seeds from 3 different catalogs. A cold frame for starting transplants in March. All of this I had discussed with Delia and planned carefully. The well I wanted a submersible electric pump to replace the hand pump for daily use, reliable, faster, not weather dependent. I had a quote. And this is where the mistake began, I looked at the property as a professional. I am a landscape architect. I look at land and I see it transform not what it is, but what it could be, with correct intervention, with thoughtful design, with the application of 30 years of professional knowledge. I looked at my 22 acres and I began to see a project. A native grass restoration on the north 10 acres. A demonstration, planting of drought-tolerant species along the county road, educational. Beautiful, potentially a source of seed stock I could sell. A designed rain garden in the low spot east of the barn that currently just held water badly. A pergola on the south face of the stone house. A kitchen garden that was not just functional, but elegant. A teaching garden, the kind of thing that people would want to see. I spent 3 days drawing plans, and then I sat with the plans and looked at them and understood what I had done. I had made it a project. I had made it professional. I had started designing it for someone else to look at, for approval, for admiration, for the external validation of a woman who had spent 30 years making beautiful things for clients. I had stopped designing it for Ruth Haskell to live in and started designing it for Ruth Haskell to present. Vera had not presented anything to anyone. Vera had grown what she needed, preserved what she grew, and planted a sunflower because she liked sunflowers. She had not built a demonstration garden. She had not considered the educational potential of her native grass seed stock. She had lived here purely and completely for herself. I put the elaborate plans in the back of the composition notebook. I wrote a new list on a fresh page. Windows, yes. Raised beds, yes. Pump, yes. Cold frame, yes. The rest, not yet. Maybe not ever. Let the land tell me what it needs rather than telling the land what I think it should be. I had come here to stop performing. Time to actually stop. Bah. Delia came on a Saturday in mid-February, and I told her about the plans, the elaborate ones, and what I'd decided. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she drank her coffee for a moment. Your aunt did that once, she said. First year or two. She had a whole plan she showed me. Sketches of what the property would look like. Beautiful things. What happened? She let it go, Delia said. She said the land had its own ideas. She said her job was to learn them, not impose hers. I thought about that. About the difference between a landscape architect and a person who lives in a landscape. I've been doing the wrong job, I said. You've been figuring out the right one, Delia said. It was a distinction she made cleanly without sentimentality. There's a difference. We looked out the window at the February property. The snow had pulled back from the garden beds, leaving the turned soil dark and exposed at the edges. The windmill was turning. The barn cast a long shadow in the low February sun. Vera's land, my land, doing what it did, persisting, offering itself, waiting for someone who was paying attention. Spring's early this year, Delia said. I can feel it. When do you plant? I asked. Last week of March for the cold-tolerant stuff. Onions, kale, spinach. Tomatoes wait for May. She set down her mug. Your beds are ready for onions now if you broke them properly in the fall. I broke them properly, I said. I know you did, she said. I saw them. Outside, something moved in the dead grass at the edge of the property. A bird I hadn't identified yet, moving low through the stem bases, quick and purposeful. What is that? I said. Delia looked. Sprague's pipit. They winter here. She paused. Not many people know that bird. Most people drive through this country and see nothing. I watched the pipit work its way along the grass edge until it disappeared behind the berm I'd built from the dugout excavation. Most people drive through this country and see nothing. I was not most people. I was becoming someone who saw. The new windows arrived the third week of February. I had ordered them from the millwork shop in Goyman, double pane size to fit the original stone openings, which were not standard dimensions and required custom ordering. The millwork shop had taken the measurements I'd sent without complaint, the way rural businesses adapt to their clients' unusual situations, and the windows came wrapped in craft paper in the back of a delivery truck that made it to the bottom of the county road and no further on account of the ruts. I drove down into my truck and transferred them, 4 windows double pane, about 40 pounds each, into the bed and drove them up. This is the kind of logistics that you work out when you live on a road the county has chosen to mostly ignore, and you work it out not with frustration, but with the practical creativity that remote living requires. You find out where the delivery can get to, and you go the rest of the way yourself. Setting the windows was a 2-person job for the outside frame, ceiling, and I called Delia, who came on a Saturday morning with her truck and an aluminum ladder, and no commentary about being asked. We worked efficiently. I framed, she held, I set the screws. She handed tools in the manner of 2 people who had established that their skills complement each other and that neither of them has time for any dynamic that is more complicated than that. By noon, all 4 windows were in. I sealed the exterior with weatherproof caulk and went inside and stood in the main room and felt the difference immediately. The light was the same pale February light from the south and east windows. But the cold that had always pressed through the glass, the specific cold seep that single pane produces, the feeling of standing 3 feet from a window and knowing the winter was right there, separated from you by an inch of glass that was gone. The room was sealed, actually sealed, for the first time since I'd arrived. I put my hand flat against the new glass. It was nearly room temperature. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the warm glass, looking out at the February prairie, the tawny grass, the long shadows of the windmill, the berm of the dugout rising on the hillside, everything pale and cold and far, and felt something I had not felt in this house until now. That the house was mine. Not just legally mine, not just possession mine, but mine in the way that a thing you have fixed and weathered and filled with your own work and your own decisions becomes yours. The way a garden becomes yours, not when you buy it, but when you have broken the soil with your own hands, intended it through its first season, and seen it survive something hard and come back. This was mine. I had made it mine. Certain. The letter from Douglas arrived in the last week of February. Not from his attorney, from him. A white business envelope with his handwriting. I still knew it after 34 years. The slightly oversized capital letters, the way his D's looped, addressed to me at a Boise City P.O. box that Claire had set up for my legal correspondence. She had included the box number in her own communications to me, and somehow Douglas had gotten it. I opened it at the kitchen table. It was 2 pages handwritten, and I will not reproduce it in full, because the full content is not the point. The gist of it was he was sorry. He had not handled things well. He wanted me to know that the business with the land had been in his telling a decision he'd made in a moment of panic about money and the future, and a business arrangement that had been pressing him for 2 years that he had not told me about, and he had made it badly and in secret because he knew I would object, and he hadn't known how to have the conversation, and he was sorry. He said he had not expected me to go to Oklahoma. He said he thought I was stronger than he'd given me credit for. He said he hoped I was all right. I read it twice. Then I folded it along its creases and set it on the table. I sat with it for a while. Here is what I found sitting with it. I believed him. Not that it excused it. A business decision made in panic does not excuse selling land that was half mine without asking me. But I believed the panic, and I believed the not knowing how to have the conversation, because that had been Douglas in all the ways that mattered, capable and organized in his domain, avoidant in the emotional terrain that required him to risk something. He had managed the farm, the finances, the business relationships, all of it correctly and well for 34 years. And when it went wrong, he had not come to me. He had gone around me. Not because he didn't love me, because he was afraid of what I would think. I sat with that for a long time. Then I thought about Vera at 24, married briefly, and badly coming out to this land, and spending 31 years figuring out who she was when she was not managing someone else's fear. I thought about Ruth Haskell at 24, sitting at Vera's kitchen table, newly engaged, and Vera looking at me across the table with a directness that had made me slightly uncomfortable at the time. You have good hands. Don't let anyone talk you into keeping them still. I had let someone talk me into keeping them still. Not cruelly, not even intentionally, but I had made myself smaller across 34 years in the small ways that people do when they love someone and want the life to work. I had accommodated, I had adjusted, I had been useful and capable and present, and I had somewhere in the middle of all of that stopped asking what Ruth Haskell needed, because there was always something else that needed attending to, and Ruth Haskell could wait. Ruth Haskell had waited long enough. I got a piece of paper from the composition notebook. I wrote Douglas a letter. It was short. I told him I had received his letter, and I appreciated his honesty. I told him that I understood more than he probably expected. I told him that I did not wish him harm, which was true, and that I was well, which was also true. I told him I was living on Vera's property, and that I had repaired the roof and built a kitchen garden and dug a storm shelter into the hillside, and that I had found something here that I had not known I was looking for. I did not tell him what it was. Some things you keep for yourself. I sealed the letter and drove to Boise City to mail it on Monday. On the way home, I stopped at the top of the county road and sat for a while with the engine off, the February cold settling into the cab, slowly the property visible below me in the pale winter light. The stone house, the barn, the windmill, the berm of the dugout on the hillside, my garden beds turned and waiting. I thought about spring. I thought about the sunflowers. I started the truck and drove home. March in the Oklahoma panhandle is not spring. People who have lived in places with more moderate climates tend to think of March as the reliable edge of winter, the month when things begin. Here it is something else, a negotiation. The temperatures swing 40 degrees in a single day. A morning that starts at 16 can be 52 by 2 in the afternoon and back to 24 by midnight. The wind, which is never absent on the high plains, shifts from its winter pattern, steady northern, purposeful, to something more variable and therefore more treacherous. A south wind that carries warmth and tricks the soil, followed without warning by a north wind that takes 10 degrees an hour and freezes the foolish things that believe the warmth was permanent. The experienced farmer plants nothing until the soil tells her to plant. I was not yet an experienced farmer. But I had Delia, and Delia told me last week of March for onions. Not before. I waited. What I did in the waiting was read. Not Vera's journals. I had finished all 17 of them by the end of January, reading slowly and carefully, taking notes in the margins without a pencil I could erase later if I wanted. Though I found as I went that I did not want to erase most of what I wrote. Vera's handwriting and my penciled notes in conversation felt correct. It felt like what the journals were for. What I read in March was books I ordered from the library, 2 towns over the same library Vera had used. And when I mentioned Vera's name at the desk, the librarian, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a cord, had said, "I remember her," with the particular warmth of someone who had liked the person being remembered. I ordered books on native plant restoration, on soil science, on the agricultural history of the Southern Plains. I read about the Dust Bowl, the original one, the 1930s catastrophe that had been partly produced by exactly the kind of farming that had been tried on this land in the decades before Vera, and felt a specific kind of awe at what the people who had lived here then had survived. Vera had arrived in the 1990s on land that was still in some ways recovering from that history. The native grasses that she had let come back that grew on my property in their particular drought-adapted persistence were doing what they had always done, holding the soil against the wind, building organic matter at their roots, functioning as they had functioned for 10,000 years before the plow. I had been seeing them as scenery. I began to see them as the system. Claire came in the 3rd week of March as she had promised. She drove down from Denver, an 8-hour drive reduced by her habit of ignoring speed limits, the way practical people do on flat, straight, sparsely enforced roads, and arrived on a Friday evening in the golden last light of a March afternoon that had decided to behave like spring. She stood at the gate and looked at the property with the particular expression of a daughter who has been imagining something and is now seeing it is not what she imagined. "It's smaller than I thought," she said. "It's larger than it looks," I said. "The scale changes when you've walked it." She came inside. She walked through the stone house, slowly looking at everything the way she has always moved through spaces with the attention of an architect's daughter who grew up understanding that spaces have intentions. She looked at the new windows. She looked at the clean hearth. She opened the pantry and saw the organized shelves, the labeled jars, the arrangement of a household that has learned its own rhythms. "Mom," she said and stopped. "What? You actually live here?" "That was the plan," I said. "No, I mean," she gestured at the room, "you've made it yours. It's not a retreat or a project it's actually where you live." "Yes," I said. She sat down at the table and looked at me for a moment with the expression she has worn since she was 12 years old and was trying to categorize something that didn't fit her existing categories. "You're okay," she said. "I told you." "No, I mean actually okay. Not phone call okay. Actually." "Come see the dugout," I said. "Fine." I showed her everything the next morning. The garden beds, the soil I'd amended, the onion sets I was ready to plant. The root cellar with Vera's jars still on the shelves. The dugout which she examined with the mix of alarm and admiration that I had been expecting from my daughter alarm at the fact of her 62-year-old mother having excavated a hillside by hand, over 6 weeks admiration because she is a structural engineer and she recognized the work for what it was. "You lined it yourself," she said, running her hand along the mortared limestone. "Vera's technique," I said, "from the root cellar, patient and competent rather than artistic." "It's better than patient and competent," she said. "The drainage gravel at the base was the right call. Did you calculate the load on the frame?" "Roughly. I overbuilt it, which is the correct response to a roughly calculated load." She laughed. It was the laugh she saves for when I have done something she didn't expect, which has happened more in this visit than in the previous year. We walked the property in the afternoon. I showed her the native grass stands, the ones Vera had let come back, explaining what I'd learned about the species and their functions. I showed her the low spot east of the barn, where I had decided not to build the designed rain garden from my February plans, but had instead simply cut a shallow channel to the natural drainage path, allowing the water to move as it wanted to move. "That's not very designed," Claire said. "It's very designed," I said. "I designed it to do what it was already doing, but better." She considered this. "Is that landscape architecture, or is that just living here?" "I think at some point, they're the same thing," I said. Delia came on Sunday for coffee, and I watched Claire recalibrate in real time as she understood what Delia was not a romantic interest, not a caretaker, not a neighbor who had adopted a helpless newcomer, but a peer. A woman who had been on her land for 30 years and knew things my mother had needed to learn and had taught them without condescension, and who was now having a conversation with my mother about soil microbiology and spring planting schedules as if they had been colleagues for decades. After Delia left, Claire sat at the table for a moment without speaking. "She watched your smoke," Claire said finally, "during the blizzard. She told you. She said she watches for smoke from any property on the road that's occupied." Claire was quiet for a moment. That's a whole system. That's how it works out here. "People take care of each other in ways that don't look like caring," I said. "They just do the practical thing. The practical thing happens to be the caring thing." Claire was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to stop worrying about you," she said. "Good," I said. "Save the energy for something that needs it." I didn't say I'd stop calling. I didn't ask you to. She left Monday morning. I stood at the gate and watched her car until the road bent and the dust settled. Then I went to the barn and got the onion sets from the cool corner where I'd been storing them and went to the garden and planted. Why me? Planting onions in the panhandle in late March is a meditative act. The soil was ready. I could feel it, the correct crumble in the top 2 inches, neither too wet nor too dry. The amended beds doing what I'd hoped they'd do. I made a shallow furrow with a trowel, set the sets an inch deep and 4 inches apart, covered them, moved to the next row. The work has a rhythm that settles the mind without emptying it, you think, but you think differently than you do sitting still or driving or talking. The thoughts move at the pace of the planting, slow and considered. I thought about my professional life. I had a license. I had 30 years of experience. I had, once the settlement funds were fully accessible enough, to live on this land comfortably for years without working for income. But I was 62, not 82, and the idea of stopping entirely, of becoming only the person on this land without any outward-facing engagement, did not sit right. Vera had managed it, but Vera had not had 30 years of professional knowledge pressing to be used. I had been thinking since February about consultation work. Small-scale local, ranchers and small farmers in the region who were fighting the same problems this land had: caliche, hardpan drought, wind erosion, the slow desertification that came from decades of conventional farming in a place that didn't suit it. I had knowledge that was useful here. Not the kind I'd applied in suburban landscape commissions, the design gardens and public spaces of my career, but the deeper knowledge, soil science, plant communities, water management in arid conditions, that I had studied and continued to study. I was not ready yet. I was still learning this land, and you cannot give good advice about ground you don't fully understand. But in a year, perhaps. In 2 years. I set another onion and set in the furrow and covered it. I was not in a hurry. April came in warm and then pulled back to cold, and then came in warm again. And by the second week of April, the grass was showing the particular bright green of new growth at the base of the tawny old stems, the native grasses coming back from their roots, which had been alive all winter and were now simply resuming the way things resume when the conditions are right. The garden was doing what gardens do in April, two things at once. The onions were showing green tips 3 inches up, moving at the rate of about half an inch a day and in the good soil of the amended beds. The kale and spinach I'd started in the cold frame were ready for transplant, hardened off from the temperature swings that March had provided. And in the cold frame, the tomato seedlings I'd started from Vera's Save Seed, the ones labeled in her hand from a 2019 packet, were 3 inches tall and deeply green and doing very well. I had been nervous about Vera's seeds. They were 6 years old, which is at the edge of reliable germination for tomatoes, and I had planted 6 seeds per cell, expecting some failure. Every one of them had germinated. Every single seed Vera had saved and sealed and stored in her labeled envelopes in the tin box on the root cellar shelf had come up. I stood in the cold frame on a morning in mid-April and looked at 6 cells of vigorous, healthy tomato seedlings started from a dead woman's saved seed, and felt something I do not have a single word for. Gratitude is too simple. It was more structural than gratitude. It was the recognition of a chain. Vera had grown these tomatoes in her garden on this land. She had eaten them and she had saved the seeds, and she had packed them carefully and written the date and drawn her little sunflower on one envelope and sealed the box and put it on the shelf. And then she had died, and the seeds had waited in the dark of the root cellar in the right temperature in their careful paper envelopes for someone with good hands to come and open the box. Here I was. Here they were. Hmm. Delia came for coffee on a Saturday in late April, and we talked for 3 hours, which was the longest we had talked without a specific task to accomplish. Something had shifted in the friendship. There is a threshold in any friendship where the practical acquaintance becomes something warmer, and we had crossed it without making it explicit the way women of a certain age cross such thresholds without ceremony or announcement. She told me about her own arrival on her property 30 years before. A marriage that had not ended in divorce but in the death of her husband, unexpected cardiac at 52, leaving her with the land and the debt on it and 2 children in college who needed her to be all right before she had any business being all right. I didn't choose to come here alone, she said. I was already here. I just had to decide to stay. That's different from what I did, I said. Not as different as you'd think, she said. The staying is the same. The choosing to stay is the same. You either learn what the land needs and become someone who can provide it, or you sell it and move somewhere easier and wonder about it for the rest of your life. Did you ever wonder, I said. Every winter, she said. First 5 years every winter, then less, then not anymore. I thought about that, about the length of a life and the slow work of becoming settled in it. Not settled meaning passive, but settled meaning rooted. The way a transplant settles into new ground slowly through repeated stress and recovery, until the root system reaches the depth where the water is, and then it is fine. Then it is exactly where it should be. I haven't wondered yet, I said. No, she said. I can see that. She looked out the window at the April property, the onion greens in their rows, the cold frame catching the low morning sun, the windmill running in a south wind, the native grass standing up bright and new at the edges of the yard. Your aunt used to say this place either takes you or it doesn't, Delia said. She said it took her in the first week, and she never looked back. It took me in the first day, I said. I just didn't know what I was saying yes to yet. Delia nodded slowly, the nod of someone who understands that specific experience. Then she poured more coffee, and we talked about the planting schedule for May and the particular characteristics of the south-facing slope where I was going to put the sunflowers, and what variety of winter squash did best in the panhandle. And the conversation was so exactly right, so completely what I needed, what the morning needed, what this life needed, that I did not think about Douglas or the settlement or the house in Wichita that was now on the market or the career I was renegotiating or any of the structures that had defined my previous life. I thought about the sunflowers. I thought about Vera's little drawing on the envelope. I thought about planting them in May along the south fence where they would have room to grow. May arrived on the panhandle with the confidence of a season that has been waiting its turn. The mornings were still cool, 45 at dawn, but by 9 o'clock the sun was doing serious work, and by midday the garden needed water from the submersible pump I'd installed in March, the deep well electric motor quietly doing in 30 seconds what the hand pump required 3 minutes to accomplish. I had not retired the hand pump. It stayed at its pad beside the barn primed and ready, because an electric pump that loses power is a pump that does not work, and I had learned enough about single-point dependencies to avoid them wherever I could. But the submersible pump gave me the water management that a kitchen garden in May requires, and the garden was responding. The onions were 8 inches tall and thickening at the base. The kale and spinach were producing leaves I was taking in quantities that exceeded what I could eat fresh, which was exactly the situation Vera's canning equipment existed to address. I had bought new lids for the mason jars in bulk, and I was learning to can in the careful, methodical way that food safety requires following the university extension guidelines I'd printed at the library. The tomatoes transplanted in the first week of May, when the soil temperature was consistently above 60 degrees at 6 inches depth, were in the ground and hardening off, showing the slight wilt of a plant that has just been asked to do something difficult and is deciding whether it can. They decided they could. By the third week of May, the tomatoes were upright and reaching the canopy, spreading in the characteristic way of plants that have found their footing. I had 11 plants from Vera's seeds staked with bamboo from a bundle I'd bought in Boise City, and they were moving toward the abundant, messy, productive sprawl that a well-established tomato plant achieves by midsummer. Vera's tomatoes growing on Vera's land from Vera's saved seed in beds I had prepared, with Vera's tools and amended with compost from Vera's barn corner. 6 years between her hands and mine. Not broken, not lost. Continuing. I planted the sunflowers on the 22nd of May along the south fence as I had planned since February. It was a Saturday, cool and clear, the kind of morning that the panhandle sometimes offers in May, before the heat becomes absolute a morning. With an edge to it, still the light clean and low angle at 8 o'clock, the grass moving in a soft south wind that was all warmth and no threat. I opened Vera's envelope. The seeds were large and heavy, a big sunflower variety, as labeled the kind that produces heads 8 inches across on 6-foot stems. I had prepared the bed along the south fence the week before, loosened the soil, added compost, confirmed the drainage. I made holes with my index finger 2 inches deep, 1 foot apart along the full length of the 40-foot fence row. I placed one seed in each hole. I covered each one. I stood up and looked at what I had done, which was a row of disturbed soil along a fence with nothing visible above it, which is what planting always looks like. From outside, the seed's work is entirely invisible, happening below the surface. And what you are trusting when you plant is not what you can see, but what you know about what happens in the dark. A lot of what I had learned since October was exactly that, what happens in the dark. The marriage had been breaking in the dark for years before I knew. Vera had been building her life in the dark of an Oklahoma winter for 31 years, and what she built was invisible to everyone who passed on the county road and saw just a woman alone on a small property. The root cellar and the seeds and the journals and the arrangement with Delia, watch the smoke if it stops, come all of it in the dark, all of it continuing, all of it ready when it was needed. I had built a dugout in December in the literal dark of January nights, and it waited now on the hillside, the entry framed and tight, the stove cold but ready, the army cot with Vera's blankets waiting for whatever November brought this year. Preparation for what might happen in the dark. This is wisdom, I thought. Not the wisdom that announces itself, not the motivational kind, not the kind that makes good framing, but the real kind, the kind that is just, I know what can happen here. And I have made the correct arrangements, and now I can tend my tomatoes in peace. I went back to the house and made coffee and sat on the step in the morning sun and looked at my property and felt cleanly and without reservation that I was exactly where I should be. But fun. Daniel came in June as I had told him to. He is not Claire. He is quieter, more internal, the kind of person who processes on delay, who takes in information and appears unmoved, and then calls you 2 weeks later with a question that shows he has been thinking about it since. He arrived on a Friday evening and stood at the gate in the same place Claire had stood and looked at the property with the expression of someone who is being asked to update a mental model he has been carrying for a long time. The model I suspected was my mother is capable and organized, but fundamentally dependent on the structures of ordinary life, the house, the marriage, the career. And without those structures, she is in some kind of crisis that she is managing with the determined competence that is her nature. The property dismantled that model in about 4 minutes. He saw the garden, the dense producing organized garden with its labeled beds and its staked tomatoes and its onions going to flower and its kale in its second cutting. He saw the barn clean and organized, Vera's tools in their proper places, plus my own additions. He saw the dugout, which I took him to immediately because I knew that would be the thing that most precisely recalibrated his assessment. He went down the entry steps and stood in the chamber and looked at the limestone walls and the framing and the ventilation pipes and the small stove and the army cot, and he said nothing for almost 30 seconds. "You dug this," he said finally. "Over 6 weeks in December," I said. "Mattock for the calichy, spade for the clay below." "By yourself?" "By myself." He turned and looked at the doorway, the framed opening, the fitted insulated panel propped against the wall. "Mom, I'm a civil engineer," he said. "I know. This is sound work." "Your grandmother's sister was a practical woman," I said. "She left me the right tools." He came back up the steps and stood on the hillside and looked at the property from this slightly elevated angle, the stone house, the barn, the windmill, the garden, the county road, visible beyond the gate, the flat prairie extending in every direction. "You're happy here," he said, not a question. "I don't know if happy is exactly right," I said. "I'm right here. It's the first time in a long time I've been right where I am." He was quiet for a moment, the internal processor quiet. "Dad called me," he said. "I know. He said you wrote him." "I did." "He said you sounded—" Daniel stopped. "Tried again." "He said you didn't sound like someone who was suffering." "I'm not," I said. He was surprised. "I know," I said. He expected one thing. I am another thing. I should have shown him that thing 30 years ago, but I didn't know how to. I'm showing it now. Daniel put his hands in his pockets, his nervous gesture since he was 10 years old, and looked at the ground. "I'm glad you're all right, Mom," he said. "I know you are," I said. Come on, I'll show you how the pump works. He looked up, and the expression on his face was something that only your children can produce, the specific relief of someone who has been quietly afraid for months and has just been told that the thing they were afraid of is not true. He was 35 years old, and he looked 22, and I loved him so much in that moment, it was almost a physical sensation. Yeah, he said, show me the pump. Yeah. We had dinner on the step that evening, Daniel and I, because the June night was warm for the first time, and the mosquitoes had not yet arrived in force, and the sunset was doing the thing it does on the panhandle. The compound gold and rose and ochre that has no simple name, and neither of us wanted to be inside while it happened. He told me about his work, a highway bridge project in the eastern part of the state, a foundation problem on a hospital expansion that had been giving him professional grief for 6 months. He talked through the problem with the focused energy he always has when he is doing the work he was made for, and I listened to the way you listen to your child being fully themselves, which is one of the particular satisfactions of parenthood. When he finished, I told him about the soil restoration, what I was learning about the native grass communities, what they were doing in the soil, why they mattered. He listened the way he always has, the civil engineer's ear, picking up the structural language underneath the botanical subject matter. You're going to consult, he said. It was an observation, not a question. Eventually, I said, for ranchers and farmers, for anyone out here trying to work with the land instead of against it. He was quiet for a moment. Vera thought of it first, he said. You said she let the grasses come back. She did, but she kept it to herself. I think I want to do something with it. Why? I thought about the answer. It was not simple. Because Vera was content to live it, I said finally. And that was right for her. But I came here from a career. I came here from 30 years of applying knowledge to problems. I think I can do both, live here the way she lived here and also use what I know. For the land, not against it, not performing, just working. Daniel looked at the darkening prairie. The first stars were showing, the earliest and brightest ones directly overhead. That sounds like you, he said. That sounds more like you than anything I've seen from you in years. I looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, he paused, trying to be precise, which is his nature. When I was a kid, you used to talk about your work like this, like it mattered, like it was connected to something real. And then at some point, it became a job. You did it well, but the light went out of the way you talked about it. He looked at me. The light is back. I did not know what to say to that. I looked at the stars instead, which were multiplying now as the sky deepened, the Milky Way beginning to resolve from a suggestion into a dense band. She fixed the pump herself, I heard Daniel say quietly, talking to no one in particular, or to the dark, or maybe to his father in some imaginary conversation he was having. She fixed the pump and dug a room in a hill, and she's fine. More than fine, I said. Yeah, he said. More than fine. The sunflowers came up in the first week of June. I was not watching for them specifically. I had planted enough seeds in my life to know that watching does not accelerate germination. But I happened to be walking the south fence on a Tuesday morning when I saw the first one, a small paired leaf pushing through the soil, the characteristic heart shape of a new sunflower seedling, holding its two seed leaves spread open in the exact attitude of something that has just arrived and is getting its bearings. I stopped walking. I stood at the fence and looked at this small, impossible thing, impossible only in the sense that 6-year-old seed in semi-arid soil that I had amended but not magically transformed is not guaranteed to germinate, is not guaranteed to produce anything, is not guaranteed at all, and felt something move through me that was grief and gratitude and something I can only call continuity all at once. Vera's sunflower. Growing. By the end of the week, there were 31 seedlings along the fence row. Not all of them I'd planted 40 seeds, so 9 had not germinated, which was within acceptable range for old seed and perfect conditions. But 31 strong, healthy seedlings with their seed leaves spread and their first true leaves just beginning to show, small and serrated, the specific shape that says this is a sunflower, this is what it will become. Watch. I watched. This is what I had learned to do in 9 months on this land watch without rushing. Pay attention without intervening. The native grasses did not need my direction. The soil amended and left to settle did its own work. The seeds, Vera's seeds, saved and stored in patient needed correct conditions and then needed to be left alone to do what they were made to do. I provided the conditions. I got out of the way. It is possible that this is a lesson available everywhere in any life without moving to an Oklahoma panhandle and surviving a blizzard. It is possible that I could have learned it in the house in Wichita, in the marriage, in the career that had become a job. But I don't think so. I think I needed the specific, irreducible fact of the land to teach it to me. The caliche that would not break until you came at it the right way. The fire that needed tending every 2 hours without fail. The storm that did not care about your plans or your previous life or your 34 years of accommodation and compromise. The earth that held its 50 degrees regardless of what was happening on the surface. I needed the thing that does not negotiate. I found it here. In September, almost exactly 1 year from the day the attorney's letter arrived at my kitchen counter in Wichita, I walked out to the south fence in the morning and stood in front of 31 sunflowers at their full height. 6 feet, 7 feet for the tallest ones. Heads 8 inches across, faces turned east in the morning and tracking west through the day in the particular heliotropic insistence that gives sunflowers their name. The seeds at the center of each head were beginning to form dense geometric, packed in the Fibonacci spiral. That is one of the mathematics nature uses most. The pattern that appears in pine cones and nautilus shells, and the seed heads of flowers that have been tracking the sun for 100,000 years. I stood in front of them for a long time. I had not, I realized, been this still in the good way, the way that is not emptiness, but fullness, the stillness of someone who is exactly where they should be, doing exactly what they should be doing, since the morning after the blizzard, when I walked across the snow in the hard blue light and felt the cold air go all the way down and heard the blue truck coming up the road. The world had not gotten smaller. It had gotten right-sized. This is the thing I want to leave you with. If you have stayed with me through this long year, I did not become someone else. I am Ruth Haskell, 62 years old, landscape architect, mother of 2 34-year marriage, ended by a man who sold my land and couldn't figure out how to apologize in person. All of that is in me. All of that made me. But I am also the person who drove southwest on a pale October morning and found a stone house in a dead woman's journals, in a root cellar full of patience, in a neighbor who watches for smoke. I am the person who broke caliche with a mattock and fixed a roof in a blizzard and dug a room into a hillside and planted seeds that came up in 31 sunflowers along a fence in September. My husband left me with nothing. Turns out nothing was exactly enough. And then I made more. The second October was different from the first. Not the land was the land doing what land does in October. On the Oklahoma panhandle, going tawny, going cool, the angle of the light shifting to something lower and more precise, the native grasses settling into their winter architecture. The windmill turned, the property made its October sounds. Gerald was back behind the barn calling in the evenings, which was either the same owl or a successor, and I had decided it did not matter. What was different was me in it. In the first October, I had been a woman arriving at an unfamiliar place with a history she was trying to outrun and a grief she was converting by force of will and physical labor into something more useful. I had not known how the pump worked, which direction the worst storms came from, how the caliche broke, or where the seed stock was, or what the neighbor's smoke watching system meant, or how to read the quality of the quiet before a front. I knew all of that now, knowing it was not what I had expected, knowing it would be. I had expected knowledge to feel like security, like putting up a wall, building an argument against what might go wrong. What it actually felt like was something quieter. Competence is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is you look at the sky and you know what it's doing. You feel the handle of the pump and know before you prime it whether it needs maintenance. You walk the fence line and read the native grass the way you would read a sentence for its meaning. The health of the root system, the moisture situation underground, the ecological story of the last several months told in what is growing and what is not. The first year had been the year of learning. The second year was the year of knowing. Man! I took my first consultation in September, 3 weeks before the anniversary of the attorney's letter. A rancher named Emmett Lowell, 67, third generation on his property 12 miles north. He had 400 acres that were deteriorating, the topsoil blowing in the spring winds, the grass composition shifting toward invasives, the water table dropping in his irrigation wells. He'd heard about me from the county extension agent, who had heard about me from Delia, who I strongly suspected had orchestrated the whole referral chain with the particular combination of efficiency and discretion that characterized everything she did. I drove out to Emmett's property on a Tuesday morning and walked it with him for 3 hours. He was a quiet man, as many ranchers are formed by a relationship with the land that does not require constant verbal processing, just attention and action. He showed me the problem areas without editorializing. I looked at the soil, the grass composition, the drainage patterns, the topography of the deteriorating sections. I asked questions about his management history, when he'd last done a prescribed burn, what his grazing rotation had been, where the invasive species had first appeared, and in what sequence. He answered directly, the way people answer when they actually want help, rather than confirmation of what they already believe. When we got back to his truck, I told him what I thought, which was that the core problem was a grazing pattern that had been compacting a specific section of his soil for 20 years and preventing the deep-rooted native species from reestablishing, and that the solution was not expensive and not fast and involved fencing off a section for 2 to 3 years and managing a controlled reintroduction of 2 grass species that he'd had historically and that his current management had pushed out. He listened. He nodded. "What'll it cost?" he said. I told him the consulting rate I'd settled on, which was below what I would have charged for urban landscape work and above what I'd seen other regional consultants charge, and which felt right for this work in this context. He nodded again. "When can you start?" "Next week," I said. He stuck out his hand. We shook. On the drive home, I felt something I had not felt in a long time in connection with my work. The specific pleasure of a problem that is real and solvable, and that you are the right person to address. Not the performance of professional competence, which is what my career had gradually become. The thing itself. So, Delia came for coffee that Saturday. She came most Saturdays now, in the comfortable way of a friendship that has established its own rhythms, and I told her about the Lowell consultation. "Emmett's a good man," she said. "His place has been struggling for a decade. He knew it, but he didn't know what to do." "He knew what to do," I said. "He needed someone to confirm it." Delia looked at me across the table. "That's what a good consultant does," she said. "I've been a bad consultant for most of my career," I said. "I told people what to do. I should have been listening harder." "You're listening now." "I'm listening now," I said. We drank coffee. Outside, the 2nd October was doing its work, the morning light moving across the property, the windmill turning in a light north wind, the garden going dormant with the dignity of things that have finished their season and know it. The tomatoes were done. I had put up 47 jars of tomatoes from Vera's plants, more than I could eat in a winter, which meant I could give some to Delia and some to the Boise City food pantry that Delia had mentioned needing contributions. The onions were drying in the barn on the same racks Vera had used, which I had found folded in the corner and deployed without modification because they were exactly right. The sunflowers had been cut and the seeds threshed and sorted, some for the pantry, some back into the tin for next year's planting, and one envelope labeled in my own hand with the year and the variety, and a small drawing added to Vera's box. I had drawn a sunflower on it, just a circle and the petals and one leaf the way a child draws it. Because Vera had, and because the sunflowers were worth commemorating, and because there was no one to see it, and because I had become the kind of person who does the small, unnecessary, beautiful thing, not for anyone else, but because it is true to who I am. "The extension agent called," Delia said. "He has 2 more ranchers who want to talk to you." "Tell him November," I said. "I want to get the winter prep done first." "What's left on the winter prep?" I thought through the list. The woodpile was adequate. I'd started splitting in August, and had kept at it a more systematic approach than the panicked session before the November blizzard. The dugout had been inspected, and the stove cleaned, and the door panel reseated, and the cot refitted with a new canvas piece that Daniel had found and mailed. The pump was serviced. The windows were good. The pantry was better stocked than Vera's had been when I arrived. "Not much," I said. "I'm ahead of where I was last year." Delia nodded. "That's how it goes. First year, you're always catching up. Second year, you're ahead. By the 5th year, you stop thinking about it." "How long until I stop thinking about the winter?" I said. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions. 5 years, she said, maybe 4. "I can wait," I said. I called Pamela Goss in October to close out the remaining paperwork from the divorce settlement, which had been finalized in August in the quiet administrative way that endings happen when neither party is pursuing drama. Douglas had signed everything without further contact. The house in Wichita had sold in July. The final accounting was complete. "We got you 71%, Pamela said. "You did," I said. "Better than I asked for." He didn't fight the final offer, she said. I think he was ready to be done. I thought about Douglas somewhere in Kansas in whatever life he had made since October of last year. The business arrangement he'd been managing in secret, I had learned more about it eventually enough to understand that it had been less a betrayal than a panic. A man who had been afraid to tell his wife that the financial situation was harder than he'd let on, who had made one bad decision alone, and then spent 18 months building a structure of secrets to contain it until the structure collapsed and he walked out rather than face what he'd done. I did not excuse it. I had stopped being angry about it around February, when the cold was serious and the work was pressing and anger required energy I needed for other things. What was left was not forgiveness, exactly. I am not sure I believe in forgiveness as a transaction, something you grant and then are done with, but something more like understanding. He had been afraid. He had not known how to be afraid with me. That was a failure, and it had cost both of us, and it was done. Thank you, Pamela, I said, for everything. You were an easy client, she said. You knew what you wanted. I learned that, I said. It took a while, but I learned it. Fine. November came. I had been watching the sky since the third week of October, in the way that I now watch skies, not anxiously, not with the half-dread of a person who is not ready, but with the attentive interest of someone who wants to understand what is coming so she can meet it correctly. The patterns had been running cold in the north, the same building pressure that had preceded last year's blizzard, but moving differently. Not stalling, not rebuilding, moving south in a single wave that the forecasters said would deliver cold, but not the sustained siege of last November. I believed them and I prepared anyway. Full wood pile, full water store, dugout stocked and ready, pantry complete. Truck battery replaced in September on Delia's advice. She had replaced hers every third year without fail and had never had a truck fail to start in cold, which was a better record than mine. The cold front came on the 7th of November, almost exactly a year from the first blizzard. It came fast and clean, not the building wall of last year, but a sudden north wind that dropped the temperature 15 degrees in 2 hours and brought 6 inches of snow before midnight, and then before dawn, stopped. By morning, the sky was the hard blue of a delivered storm. The temperature was 14 degrees. The property was covered in clean, unmarked white. I made coffee, I put on my layers, I went outside. The footprints I left in the snow were the first marks on the white surface. There had been no wind in the night, no animal traffic visible yet, just the undisturbed plain of new snow in the hard morning light. My boots made the compression sound, the specific high pitch of cold crystallized snow under weight, and behind me was the evidence of my passing 2 lines of footprints, from the door to where I stood at the edge of the garden, neat and unremarkable, the tracks of a person going about her morning. I looked at the property, stone house, barn, windmill, gate, the county road beyond. The dugout's berm under white, the entry door just visible. The sunflower stalks still standing along the south fence, stripped of their heads, but still upright, holding the snow in their joints. 1 year. I had arrived here in October of last year with a letter from an attorney and a truck full of books and tools and 3 months of shelf-stable food and a level of stubbornness that I had always had but never previously applied to my own life with full force. I had broken caliche and fixed roofs and survived a 3-day blizzard and dug a storm shelter by hand and planted a dead woman's seeds and watched them grow. I had found a neighbor worth keeping. I had started doing work that mattered. I had received a letter from a frightened man and written back without hatred. I had drawn a sunflower on a seed envelope. None of this was dramatic. None of it would make a film. It was just a woman on her land in November looking at her property in the snow, understanding that she was here and that here was right and that she intended to stay. Behind me, Gerald called from the barn. I turned around and looked in the direction of the sound. The barn roof was white. The windmill was still. The sky went on forever. "Morning, Gerald," I said. He called again, then was quiet the way owls are present, and then absent, watching from somewhere you can't see, doing the work that owls have always done in the dark. I went back inside. I put 2 pieces of wood on the coals and watched them catch. I opened a new composition notebook, the first of what I intended to be my own series, sitting on the shelf beside Vera's 17, and I wrote the date at the top of the first page. Then I wrote year 2. The ground is good. Begin. Epilogue. Here is what I want to tell you. If you are a woman my age or any age who has been through something hard and come out the other side not sure what you are supposed to do next, you are not obligated to become a different person. You are not obligated to find yourself in the way that phrase usually means, as if the self were a thing you'd mislaid and just needed to locate. You have not mislaid yourself. You have been here all along. You were here when you were managing someone else's fear here, when you were making breakfast in a house that was being quietly sold out from under you here, when you drove southwest on a pale October morning toward a derelict stone house because there was nowhere else to go. What you can do. What I am suggesting you consider is the thing that Vera did and that I did after her: find the difficult ground and stay in it. Not because difficulty is virtue, not because suffering builds character, which is one of the more exhausting lies that gets told to people going through hard things, but because the difficult ground, the thing that requires your real attention, your actual knowledge, your specific hands doing specific work, has no room in it for the parts of you that aren't really you. In the difficult ground, you find out what you're actually made of. I am made of the same material as Vera: patient, observant, capable of working long past the point where it would be reasonable to stop, capable of sitting very still in a warm dugout and listening to the winter press on the ground above and feeling underneath the cold the permanent 50 degrees of the earth that holds regardless. I am my mother's niece. I am a landscape architect who has finally found the right landscape. I have 31 sunflower plants along the south fence that came from a dead woman's seed, and next year I will have more, and the year after that more still, because that is what sunflowers do. When you plant them in prepared ground, they return. My husband left me with nothing. I planted it. I am watching it grow. The Lowell consultation went well. I spent 8 days across October and November walking Emmett's deteriorated sections, taking soil cores, mapping the grass composition, with the systematic attention I had brought to every professional project in my career. And that felt now entirely different from what it had felt like before. The difference was this: I was not managing an outcome. I was reading a situation and reporting what I found, and proposing what the evidence suggested, and then stepping back and letting Emmett decide. He decided correctly, which I had expected. He knew his land. He just needed the specific vocabulary for what he was seeing. I drove home from the last Lowell session in the November dusk, the truck moving along the county road toward my gate, the property coming into view as I came over the low rise, the stone house, the barn, the windmill, still in no wind, everything in the particular warm amber light of a panhandle sunset that was brief and spectacular, and then gone. I pulled up to the gate and sat for a moment with the engine running. This was the view I had come over the rise to see for 13 months now. It did not stop being the right view. I got out and opened the gate and drove through and closed it behind me and drove up to the house and turned off the engine. The silence was complete and right. I sat in the truck for a moment the same way I had sat 13 months ago when I first arrived and did not yet know what I was saying yes to. The same truck, different Ruth. Not a better Ruth necessarily. Not a worse one. A Ruth who knows how the pump works. Who knows which direction the worst storms come from. Who knows the call of a great horned owl and the name Vera gave him, and the weight of the mattock that broke the caliche, and the smell of 31 sunflowers tracking the September sun. A Ruth who is right where she is. I went inside. I built the fire. But 2 small things happened in the second week of November that I want to record, because small things, I have learned, are what a life is actually made of. The first, I received a seed catalog from a small native plant nursery in the Texas Panhandle that I had ordered from in the spring, and in the back of the catalog, in the customer submission section that seed catalogs maintain in the tradition of the gardening letter, where customers write about their growing season, there was a letter from a woman in Colorado who had used the nursery seed to restore a section of disturbed native grassland on her property, and she described in 4 paragraphs the process and the result and what it had felt like to watch the restoration take hold. And I read it 3 times and then wrote her name and address on a note card and put it on my desk to write to her. Because she was doing what I was learning to do. Because she had found words for what I had not yet found words for. Because this is how knowledge moves in the world, not only through institutions and programs and professional credentials, but through women writing to each other about what they have grown. The second thing, on a Sunday morning in mid-November, I was in the garden doing the last of the winterizing, pulling the spent tomato stakes, turning the final section of bed covering the onion bed with straw mulch, when I heard Delia's truck on the road. She pulled up to the gate and got out and came through and walked to the garden and stood watching me work for a moment. "I have a proposition," she said. I straightened up. "All right." The Extension Service wants to do a soil restoration workshop for ranchers and small farmers in the county. They asked me to be part of it. She paused. I told them they wanted you more than me. I looked at her. They want me to lead it. They want us both, she said. My 30 years of practice, your 30 years of training. Between us, we have the whole picture. She paused again. I told them I'd ask. I thought about it for exactly as long as it required, which was not long. Yes, I said. Delia nodded. No surprise, no particular pleasure on her face she had expected. Yes, because she had learned how to read me, and she would have been surprised by no. This was just two women in a garden in November deciding to do a thing together that was worth doing. February, she said. Extension office in Boise City, half day. I'll prepare the soil section, I said. You take the grass management. That's what I was thinking. She stayed for coffee. We sat at the table, Vera's table, my table, and talked through the workshop structure and what ranchers in this county most needed to understand and how to say it in language that would reach people who had been doing this work for generations and were not interested in academic terminology for its own sake. It was the best professional conversation I'd had in 10 years. When Delia left, I stood at the window and watched her truck go and felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has figured out the right work and is doing it in the right place with the right people. This was not the life I had planned. My plan at 62 had been continue the marriage, continue the career, begin the slow deceleration toward retirement, see the grandchildren if Claire and Daniel ever produced any, take a long trip somewhere I hadn't been. This was not that. This was better. Not because suffering led to something good, which is the narrative people reach for when they need a tidy morale. I did not need to be left by Douglas to become this person. I had always had this person in me. Vera had seen her when I was 24. My son had seen the light go out of me when I stopped being her. What the leaving did was remove the structure that had been covering her. That is all. And underneath, waiting patient, at 50 degrees, the temperature the earth maintains regardless. She was fine. She had always been fine. She just hadn't been given the ground to grow in. Now she had it. Now she was growing. There is one more thing I want to tell you. In December, the 2nd December, a year after I had broken the caliche and built the dugout and driven to Boise City for lumber and fire brick and bag mortar, I drove out to Emmett Lowell's property to check on the fenced section we had taken out of grazing. It had been 6 weeks. 6 weeks is not long enough for a meaningful recovery in native grassland. Vegetation restoration is measured in years, not weeks, and I had told Emmett this clearly and repeatedly, but I wanted to see the beginning. I parked at the section fence and got out. The December light was low and clean, coming from the south at a flat angle. I walked the fence line, slowly looking at the ground inside. What I saw was not dramatic. It was never going to be dramatic in the visual sense that people expect recovery to look like the sudden flush of green, the obvious flourishing. What I saw was the absence of something, the absence of the compaction signs, the broken soil crust beginning to heal the spaces between the remaining grass clumps where the seed bank in the soil was beginning to assess its situation. Under the surface below what I could see, the root systems of the surviving native plants were doing what root systems do when the pressure above them is relieved, extending, reaching, moving toward the water, doing the work in the dark. I stood at the fence for a long time. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the section, not the section I was watching, but from the healthy grass beyond it where the native species had maintained themselves. The sound came across the fence and into the recovering ground as if it were surveying its territory and finding that territory expanding. Maybe that is too much metaphor. Maybe it was just a meadowlark. But I had spent 14 months learning to watch this land without imposing my interpretations on it, and what I saw at that fence was the thing I had been trying to teach Emmett and would try to teach the ranchers and farmers who came to the February workshop and would try to demonstrate on my own 22 acres for as long as I was on them. The land wants to recover. Given the right conditions, the right management, the right attention, the right decision to get out of the way and let what was already there do what it was always trying to do, the land moves toward health. Not quickly, not dramatically. Underground, invisibly in the dark, at its own pace, following its own route map, toward the water that is there, whether you can see it or not. This is not a metaphor. This is just how grassland ecology works. But standing at the fence in the December light, with the meadowlark calling in the distance and the healing ground beginning its slow, invisible work at my feet, I thought, it is also exactly what I have been doing. In the dark, underground. at my own pace, following my own route map toward whatever water was always there. Ruth Haskell, 63 years old come January, landscape architect, soil restoration consultant, keeper of 17 composition notebooks, in the beginning of a new series, planter of 31 sunflowers, neighbor to Delia Marsh, tenant of a stone house on 22 acres in Cimarron County, Oklahoma. Vera's niece, her own person, moving toward the water, and the meadowlark sang, and the December light moved across the healing ground. And I got back in my truck, and I drove home.